The lights of Castelia City never fully go out, even in the deep hours when the rest of Unova has grown still and quiet. There is something about the 5th generation of Pokémon that lingers differently than the others, something that settles in the mind long after the cartridge has been set aside and the room has gone dark. The Unova region holds its mysteries close, tucked inside design choices and developer decisions that most players never paused long enough to notice. And before you drift any further, settle in as we begin tonight's relaxing journey through the world of Pokémon. If this helps you unwind, subscribe to join the Cozy Club. There is a great deal of ground to cover, and it begins, as most things in Unova do, with duality. Pokémon Black and White were built around a theme that ran deeper than most Pokémon games had gone before. Truth and ideals were not simply words written into dialogue. They were woven into the architecture of the game itself, into the characters, the region, the names, and the legendary Pokémon that stood at the center of everything. Reshiram represented truth, Zekrom represented ideals, and the player, caught between the two, had to decide which version of the world they were willing to fight for. That tension was never accidental. Every element of the game was arranged to reinforce it, including details that most players encountered without ever realizing what they were looking at. The 2 box legendaries of Pokémon Black and White were designed with this duality in mind from the very beginning of their creation. The initial concept sketches for both Reshiram and Zekrom were produced by an artist named Kiko Morizuga, who worked during the early design phase of the games. She later noted publicly that Reshiram's final appearance ended up significantly different from the drafts she had originally created. Zekrom, by contrast, remained much closer to her original vision. That comment opens a quiet door in the imagination, asking what Reshiram might have looked like before the design shifted into the creature players eventually came to know. What Reshiram lost in those revisions, and what was added, remains something only those inside the development process could fully describe. The final design became a white dragon with an engine-like tail and a flowing feather-like build that felt both ancient and mechanical. Something about that combination of natural and technological elements gave Reshiram a presence that felt unlike other legendary Pokémon before it. But knowing that the design underwent significant changes suggests that an earlier Reshiram existed somewhere, perhaps more angular, perhaps more serpentine, perhaps something that would have shifted the feel of the game entirely had it survived, as Zekrom carried its own quiet history as well, even if the changes it went through were less dramatic. In an interview with a German Pokémon fan site called Visa Fans, the game's director Junichi Masuda revealed that Zekrom was originally planned to have 4 hands rather than 2. That detail is easy to read past quickly, but sitting with it reveals how different the creature might have felt in practice. A 4-handed Zekrom would have carried a very different kind of menace. The final Zekrom feels powerful but contained, with its broad chest and turbine tail creating a silhouette that reads as controlled force. 4 hands would have introduced something more chaotic, something that might have shifted the creature away from the electrical precision that defines its final character. The decision to settle on 2 hands kept Zekrom readable and gave it a cleaner silhouette that worked well against Reshiram's more flowing form. 2 legendary Pokémon standing opposite each other need to feel like genuine counterparts, and the contrast between Zekrom's angular darkness and Reshiram's curved light accomplished that in a way that 4 hands might have complicated. There is another detail about Zekrom that arrived unexpectedly and from an outside source before the game had finished sharing its own secrets. In the year 2010, when Reshiram and Zekrom had been revealed visually, but their types had not yet been officially announced, a voice actress named Shoko Nakagawa made a post on her personal blog. Nakagawa had worked closely with the Pokémon franchise, contributing to the anime and hosting various Pokemon television programs in Japan. In her post, she wrote about a character she had voiced in the film Zoroark Master of Illusions, describing how that character loved electric-type Pokemon and had wanted to capture Zekrom. At the time, Zekrom's electric dragon typing had not been made public. The post confirmed something that Game Freak had not yet officially announced. The entry was removed from her blog shortly afterward, but not before it had been noticed. It stands as one of the rare moments when information about a Pokemon game slipped out not through a data leak or a promotional accident, but through the genuine enthusiasm of someone connected to the franchise who simply said something too soon. There is something almost charming about that. The secret was not stolen. It was shared out of love before the right moment had arrived. As we drift a little deeper into the world of Unova, it becomes clear that its human characters carry just as much hidden meaning as its legendary Pokemon. Ghetsis, the primary villain of Pokemon Black and White, is a figure designed with a great deal of careful and unsettling detail. Most players remember the eye patch that covers one of his eyes. But in early concept art for the character, that eye patch is absent, and what lies beneath it is visible. A large scar surrounds his right eye in those early images, suggesting that the eye patch was added later in development to conceal the wound rather than to define the character from the beginning. The scar implies a history. Something happened to Ghetsis before the events of the game, something that left marks. The right side of Ghetsis' body carries a consistent pattern of concealment and damage that many players noticed only gradually over multiple playthroughs. His right arm is almost always hidden beneath his cloak. In the opening cinematic of Pokemon Black and White, there is a brief moment when that arm becomes visible, and what is revealed is troubling. The arm appears entirely black and seems deformed in a way that ordinary fabric or shadow cannot explain. Taken alongside the scar and the eye patch, this suggests that the entire right side of the character's body was severely damaged at some point in his past. The game never explicitly explains what caused this. The detail extends even further than most players realize. If one looks closely at Ghetsis' in-battle sprites from Black and White, and then at his three-dimensional model in later appearances, the right side of his mouth can be seen dropping slightly. It is a small thing, easily overlooked in the heat of a battle, but it completes a picture of a character whose damage runs deep and whose history the games never fully illuminate. The mystery of what happened to Ghetsis is embedded in his design rather than explained in his dialogue, which is a quiet form of storytelling that rewards those who look carefully and linger long enough to notice. Another character from the Unova games carries a very different kind of hidden meaning in his design, one built around language and wordplay rather than visual damage. Ingo, who serves as one of the two subway masters in Pokemon Black and White, became a beloved figure in a later game set entirely in a different region. His appearance in Pokemon Legends Arceus, a game focused on the ancient Sinnoh region, surprised many players. He appears there with no memory of how he arrived, serving as a warden connected to the Pokemon Sneasler and granting the player the ability to climb in that game. The reason for his inclusion in that role is rooted in his Japanese name. In Japanese, Ingo is called Nobori, which closely resembles the Japanese phrase Yama Nobori, meaning mountain climbing. That phonetic similarity is almost certainly what led the developers to place Ingo specifically into the role of climbing warden in Legends Arceus. A name that seemed like a simple character detail turned out to carry a meaning that shaped where the character would eventually travel and what purpose he would eventually serve in a game set thousands of years before his own home. Names in the Unova games carry weight at almost every turn. The champion of the Unova region, a trainer named Alder, takes his name from the alder moth. The connection seems straightforward at first, given that Alder specializes in bug-type Pokémon, and his signature partner is Volcarona, which is itself a moth. But the alder moth carries an additional layer of meaning that the game never states directly. The alder moth has a notably black and white color scheme, which aligns it with the games it appears in more precisely than just a shared insect theme. The moth is visually appropriate for a champion in Pokémon Black and White in a way that goes beyond type specialty alone. The three rivals of Pokémon Black and White carry their own symbolic weight in their very names and the roles they play throughout the story. Bianca, Sharon, and N are each designed to embody one of the game's central philosophical concerns. Bianca's story involves confronting a truth she finds difficult to accept, specifically that she is not as strong a trainer as her friends. Sharon pursues an ideal, the ideal of becoming the most powerful trainer he can be, sometimes at the cost of understanding why strength matters. N carries the most complex role, fighting with himself throughout the game to discover what balance between truth and ideals actually looks like. Their names support these roles in a precise way. Bianca's name derives from the Italian and Spanish word for white, connecting her to truth and the legendary Reshiram. Sharon's name is rooted in the Bulgarian word for black, connecting him to ideals and Zakrom. N's full name, Natural Harmonia Gropius, contains the concept of harmony within it, reflecting the balance he ultimately comes to represent. The three rivals are not simply characters who battle the player. They are living arguments about what it means to live well, dressed in the visual language of color and contrast. The Unova region itself participates in this symbolism in ways that extend beyond its characters. The region was designed around New York City and the surrounding areas of the northeastern United States. Its urban sprawl, its dense, interconnected routes, and its variety of environments reflect the layered complexity of a city where many different cultures and perspectives exist alongside each other. The numerous bridges visible throughout Unova are not simply geographical features. They can be read as visual representations of the game's central message, that a bridge between truth and ideals is what both the region and its story are ultimately asking the player to build. The director Junichi Masuda revealed in an interview that the decision to base Unova on New York came partly from a desire to make a dramatic change from previous Pokémon regions. But there was another factor in that choice, one that is quietly personal. Masuda explained that he had organized Pokémon music concerts across various regions of Japan, including Kanto, Kansai, Kyushu, and Hokkaido, each one connecting to the Pokémon regions represented in the games at the time. When considering where a future concert might be held, he thought of New York because of its famous musical theaters and opera venues in Manhattan. The city's relationship with performance and spectacle was part of what drew him toward it as a setting. That is a quietly human origin for a Pokémon region. The grand urban sprawl of Unova, with all its symbolic architecture and thematic bridges, began at least in part with the composer imagining where a concert might sound its best. As we settle a little more deeply into these discoveries, it is worth pausing on a detail that connects two different generations of design in an unexpected way. Haxorus, the powerful dragon-type Pokémon found in the Unova region, holds a distinction that most players who encountered it never knew. According to Masuda and developer Ken Sukamori, Haxorus was the first Pokémon designed specifically for what would become Pokémon Black and White. What makes this detail quietly remarkable is the timing. Haxorus was being designed while Pokémon Platinum, a game for the preceding generation, was still in active development. The two projects were not separated by a clean handoff. They overlapped. Somewhere inside Game Freak's offices, a team was polishing the final details of a Sinnoh adventure while another set of hands was already sketching the axe-bladed dragon that would anchor a new region. That image of overlapping development cycles says something meaningful about how these games come into being. The world a player enters when they begin a new Pokémon game has often been quietly forming for years before the previous world was even released. Unova was already taking shape in pencil and pixel while players were still discovering Sinnoh for the first time. The Unova region's relationship with duality extended even into its Elite Four, though in a detail so quiet that most players walked past it without a second thought. The spiral staircases leading up to each Elite Four member's chamber are designed differently depending on the gender of the trainer waiting at the top. The staircases leading to the male Elite Four members complete 2 full rotations before reaching the chamber door. The staircases leading to the female Elite Four members complete only 1. It is the kind of detail that serves no functional purpose and conveys no narrative information. It is simply there, placed by someone who wanted the architecture of the Elite Four chambers to carry a small, quiet difference that most players would never consciously register. Elite Four member Grimsley carries his own layer of hidden symbolism. His design and personality are built around a theme of gambling, referencing card games, and the unpredictable nature of chance in his visual presentation, his dialogue, and his team composition. What makes this particularly interesting is the timing of his debut. Grimsley appeared in Generation 5, which is precisely the generation when all gambling elements were officially removed from the main Pokémon game series. The Game Corner, a beloved feature of earlier generations that allowed players to gamble for coins and exchange them for prizes, ceased to exist beginning with Pokémon Black and White. Grimsley's gambling aesthetic arrived at the exact moment when gambling itself was removed from the games. Whether this was a deliberate farewell or simply an ironic coincidence is not something the developers have directly addressed. But the possibility exists that Grimsley was designed partly as an acknowledgement of the Game Corner's departure, a character who carried the spirit of chance and risk into a game that no longer had a physical space for those themes to exist in the usual way. Not all of Unova's hidden details are thematic. Some are technical, preserved in the small imperfections that survived into the finished games, despite the careful attention of the development team. The sprites used in Pokémon Black and White contained a handful of errors that have since become well documented among players who look carefully at these things. Slowpoke's battle sprite in those games was missing an eye on its tail, a small absence that should have been caught but somehow passed through. Marowak held its bone in different hands depending on which sprite was displayed, its right hand in one view and its left in another, a continuity error embedded in the basic animation of the creature. Weezing's design was rendered incorrectly in its sprite, with the third segment of its body appearing above its head rather than below it as every other depiction of the creature placed it. The Clink evolution line, a family of gear-shaped Pokémon introduced in Unova, had an error in their back sprites that resulted from how the images were mirrored. Instead of being properly rotated to reflect the direction the Pokémon was facing, the sprites were simply flipped, which meant the gear positions appeared in incorrect locations relative to the front sprites. These are small things: a missing eye on a tail, a shifted segment, an inverted gear. But they accumulate into a picture of a development process that, despite all its careful attention to symbolism and design, was also human and imperfect, and moving quickly enough that certain details slipped through unnoticed. As we drift a little further through the quiet side rooms of Unova's design history, The details begin to reveal how consistently the region's creators were thinking about the relationship between language and meaning. The name Unova itself carries this quality. The region's name combines two roots, one suggesting unity and one suggesting novelty or newness. That combination reflects the game's preoccupation with bringing different ideas and perspectives together, finding harmony between things that initially appear to be in conflict. A region named for unity and newness, built on the geography of a city famous for receiving and combining different cultures from around the world, is not a coincidence. It is a design choice that extends all the way down to the syllables. The Unova region's geography was based on a specific slice of the northeastern United States, with Castalia City drawing from Manhattan, Nimbasa City carrying echoes of Las Vegas in its entertainment and light, and the surrounding routes reflecting the variety of environments accessible from New York. But the developers did not simply copy the map. They arranged it to serve the story's needs, placing the major narrative beats in locations that reinforced the themes the game was building. The Desert Resort, the Celestial Tower, the Dragon Spiral Tower, each of these locations was positioned to feel like a natural part of the world, while also serving as a chapter marker in the story's larger arc. Dragon Spiral Tower, in particular, carries a history that the game reveals in fragments. It is described as the oldest structure in all of Unova, a place that predates the region's recorded history. Within its walls, the legendary dragon that would eventually become Reshiram or Zekrom, depending on which version the player was holding, had slept for thousands of years. The tower's architecture reflects its age. Its stones are worn and uneven. Its staircase spirals upward in a way that feels ancient rather than engineered. Even the wild Pokémon encountered there, including Drudigan and Golett, carry a sense of something preserved from an earlier age. The Golett line, in fact, carries one of Unova's more quietly fascinating design inspirations. Golett is a clay automaton, a creature animated by a mysterious internal energy. Its design draws from the concept of a golem, an artificial being brought to life through mystical means in various cultural traditions. The Pokédex entries for Golett describe the energy inside it as an unknown power that was placed there by ancient people who created it to serve as a guardian. The creature does not breathe or eat. It simply continues moving, driven by something that even the Pokémon world's researchers cannot fully explain. Golurk, its evolution, stands taller than most buildings and was described by ancient people as a protector that flew through the sky on jets of flame to guard those who could not protect themselves. There is something deeply quiet about a creature that was built to protect, that has been protecting for thousands of years, and that continues doing so without any awareness of the civilization it once served having long since passed. Golurk's chest contains a seal described in the Pokédex as holding back the energy that would otherwise consume the creature's salts entirely. If that seal is broken, Golurk goes out of control. That detail transforms a large ghost and ground-type Pokémon into something that feels genuinely ancient and genuinely dangerous in a way that goes beyond its battle statistics. The ghost-type Pokémon of Unova carry particularly interesting design histories. Chandelure, the evolution of Lampent, was designed as a chandelier-based creature whose spiritual mechanics involve drawing in the souls of those around it and burning them away. The Pokédex describes Chandelure as waving its arms to hypnotize opponents, after which it burns their spirit rather than their body. A body whose spirit has been consumed is said to wander aimlessly forever. That description is considerably darker than what appears in the visual design of the creature, which is colorful and almost decorative in appearance. The contrast between cheerful visual presentation and deeply unsettling function is something the ghost type has always played with, but Chandelure pushes it further than most. Yamask carries a perhaps the most quietly melancholy origin story of any Pokémon in the Unova regional dex. Yamask is described in the Pokédex as a spirit that was once human. Each one carries a mask that is said to be a likeness of the face it had when it was alive. The Pokédex notes that Yamask sometimes looks at that mask and weeps. The weight of that image is disproportionate to the creature's small size and simple design. A ghost carrying a portrait of its own lost face, grieving the person it used to be, is the kind of thing that lingers in memory long after the mechanics of catching and training the creature have faded. Cofagrigus, Yamask's evolution, extends this theme into the realm of ancient Egypt. Cofagrigus is designed to resemble a sarcophagus, and its Pokédex entries describe it as pulling people who come too close inside its golden shell and transforming them into mummies. The idea of a Pokémon that turns people into mummies to keep itself company is darker than its vivid gold and black appearance suggests. But the visual design is so striking and the Egyptian imagery so well executed that the unsettling implication tends to stay quietly in the background while the aesthetic takes the foreground. The design of Cofagrigus also connects to one of the more unusual facts surrounding Unova Pokémon in competitive play. For a period, Cofagrigus' name created an unexpected issue in certain Pokémon online communities where words were automatically filtered. The Pokémon's name contained a sequence of letters that triggered content filters, leading to situations where players could not type the name of a legal Pokémon in official adjacent spaces. The situation was eventually addressed in various ways by different platforms, but it stands as a reminder that even the naming of Pokémon can have unforeseen consequences in the world beyond the games. As we drift a little further into this space, the designs of Unova begin to reveal how many different directions the creative team was exploring simultaneously. Volcarona, the sun Pokémon that serves as the signature partner of Champion Alder, was described in promotional materials as a potential candidate for the legendary encounter that sits inside Relic Castle, deep beneath the desert. Players could find a single Volcarona there at a high level, waiting in a chamber that felt ceremonial rather than incidental. The Pokédex describes Volcarona as a creature born from ancient fires, one that ancient people worshipped as a substitute for the sun when volcanic ash covered the sky and blocked its light. A moth large enough and bright enough to take the place of the sun in the sky of an ancient civilization carries a mythological weight that the game does not fully explain, leaving the scale of what Volcarona represents to settle quietly in the mind. Reshiram's relationship to fire and Volcarona's relationship to fire exist in the same game without the game ever drawing a direct connection between them. Both creatures burn. Both are associated with ancient power. But Reshiram burns for truth, while Volcarona burns as a substitute for something lost. They are fires with different intentions, which is a quietly elegant way for a single game's mythology to hold multiple things simultaneously. Zekrom's relationship to electricity carries its own interesting undercurrents. The creature's design includes a turbine tail that generates the electrical energy it commands. This mechanical element gives Zekrom a character that feels partly constructed, partly technological, as though it exists at the intersection of natural power and engineered force. That combination reflects the game's theme of ideals in an interesting way. Ideals are often associated with the constructed, with the planned and the designed, rather than the naturally occurring. A dragon with a turbine for a tail fits that association in a way that rewards quiet thought. Kyurem, the third member of the Tau trio, carries a particularly haunting design history within the lore of the games. It is described as an empty shell, a legendary dragon drained of its energy by an ancient event that the games describe only in fragments. The original dragon, from which Reshiram and Zekrom separated, left Kyurem behind as what remained after the split. The Pokédex describes Kyurem as awaiting the arrival of a hero, frozen and hollow, surviving inside an ancient castle of ice. The image of a legendary Pokémon that exists in a state of incompleteness, that is defined by what it is missing rather than what it possesses, is unusual in the series and gives Kyurem a melancholy quality that neither Reshiram nor Zekrom shares. The DNA splicers, introduced in Pokémon Black and White 2, allow Kyurem to fuse with either Reshiram or Zekrom, creating Black Kyurem or White Kyurem respectively. This mechanic recontextualizes all three members of the trio, suggesting that the union restored through fusion is a temporary version of what was lost in the original separation. The fused forms are powerful but incomplete in a different way. They are reconnections without full reconciliation, which fits the sequel's exploration of what healing and continuation look like after the events of the first games. The game's narrative arc across Black and White, and then Black 2 and White 2, represents one of the more ambitious storytelling attempts in the main series. The 2-year gap between the original games and the sequels was used deliberately to show how the world had changed in the aftermath of N's departure and Team Plasma's fracturing. Characters aged, the region shifted, new structures appeared on the map. Returning players who remembered the layout of Unova from the first games found familiar geography changed in ways that felt meaningful rather than arbitrary. N himself stands as one of the most discussed characters in the franchise's history, and the details embedded in his design and his story hold up to extended examination. His full name, Natural Harmonia Gropius, was chosen with unusual care. The Gropius element is a reference to Walter Gropius, the architect and founder of the Bauhaus School of Design, which emphasized the synthesis of art and function, the harmony of opposites into something unified. Naming a character who seeks harmony between humans and Pokémon after a figure who sought harmony between art and craft is a layered choice that most players encountered without knowing the depth behind it. N was raised by Ghetsis in isolation from human society, surrounded by Pokémon who had been treated poorly by humans. That upbringing shaped his worldview completely. He believed, based on what he had seen and experienced, that Pokémon and humans were better apart from each other. The cruelty he had witnessed was the only human behavior he had been allowed to observe, and Ghetsis had arranged that deliberately. N was not a villain who had chosen his path. He was a person shaped by a constructed reality designed to produce specific beliefs. The moment when this manipulation becomes clear to N is one of the most quietly devastating scenes in the franchise. The realization that his entire understanding of the world had been engineered for someone else's purposes does not shatter him immediately. He sits with it. The game gives that moment space, which is unusual for a story told largely through brief dialogue exchanges and scripted battles. N's castle, which rises from the earth surrounding the Pokémon League at the end of Pokémon Black and White, remains one of the most visually striking locations in the series. It appears without warning, a structure that should not exist, suddenly dominating the landscape. Inside, players discover that N has been living in a single room surrounded by children's toys and Pokémon, suggesting that despite his eloquence and his certainty about his mission, some part of him remained the child he had been when Ghetsis first began shaping him. The toys are not explained. They do not need to be. As we drift a little further into Unova's quieter details, the region's relationship with music begins to emerge as another thread worth following. Pokémon Black and White were notable for introducing dynamic music that changed in response to battle conditions. When a trainer's last Pokemon was low on health, the battle music would shift, adding a layer of tension that previous games had not attempted in quite the same way. This responsiveness made the music feel like part of the world, rather than simply a backdrop to it. The soundtrack of the Unova games, composed primarily by Go Ichinos and Shota Kageyama, carried an orchestral quality and a sense of scale that matched the region's ambition. The Nimbasa city theme in particular became one of the most recognized pieces of music from the 5th generation, a track that captured the energy and neon brightness of a city built around entertainment and competition. The musical stages within Nimbasa, where the player could participate in Pokemon musicals, connected to the game's awareness of performance and spectacle as a part of Unova's character. A region partly inspired by the theaters of Manhattan would naturally make room for a city whose entire identity is built around showmanship. The Ferris wheel that sits in Nimbasa City serves as the location for one of the game's most unusual story beats. Depending on the version of the game, Anne approaches the player for a conversation while the Ferris wheel moves slowly through its rotation. The scene is quiet in a way that most of the game is not. The music softens. The movement of the wheel gives the conversation a gentle, drifting quality. Anne speaks about his experiences and his beliefs without any urgency, and the player sits opposite him with no ability to respond except by listening. It is a conversation designed to feel like something happening between two people rather than between a player and a game system. The Ferris wheel was also the location for a different kind of encounter on specific days of the week, when various characters from within the game world would appear there for brief conversations that revealed small additional details about their lives. These optional exchanges were easy to miss and gave no reward beyond the dialogue itself. They existed simply to suggest that the people of Unova continued living their lives beyond their roles in the main story. That quality of suggesting a world beyond the edges of the screen is something the Unova games pursued more deliberately than many of their predecessors. The Join Avenue feature introduced in the sequels, Pokemon Black 2 and White 2, created a space where players could see evidence of an ongoing community, with shops and services that developed based on interactions with other players. The idea that Unova was a living region rather than a static backdrop was embedded into the design at multiple levels. The Battle Subway, which Ingo oversees alongside his counterpart Emmett, extends this sense of depth into the game's post-story content. The two subway masters are designed as complementary figures whose visual symmetry mirrors the game's larger theme of duality. They wear matching uniforms with different color accents. They have the same general silhouette, but distinct expressions, Ingo appearing more serious and Emmett more cheerful. Together, they operate a system that runs continuously beneath the city, a reminder that even the infrastructure of Unova participates in its symbolic language. Emmett's name, like Ingo's, carries a linguistic connection. While Ingo's Japanese name evokes mountain climbing, Emmett's Japanese name Kudari means descent, specifically going downward. The two names together create a vertical axis, one going up and one going down, which maps onto their roles as operators of a subway system that carries passengers both above and below ground. The wordplay is quiet but consistent, another example of the way Unova's creators embedded meaning into choices that most players received without consciously recognizing. The Pokédex entries for Unova Pokémon frequently gesture toward a natural history that extends beyond what the games depict directly. Archeops, the restored fossil Pokémon of the region, is described in the Pokédex as perhaps the ancestor of all bird Pokémon, a creature that represents an evolutionary origin point for an entire category. Its ability, Defeatist, reduces its attack power when its health drops below half, which was noted by players as a strange mechanical choice for a Pokemon otherwise capable of impressive damage. The flavor justification embedded in the ability name and design is that Archeops, as an ancient and imperfectly evolved creature, loses its will to fight when seriously injured in a way that more evolved Pokemon do not. The ability tells a story about the limitations of antiquity. Archeops' pre-evolution is the creature in the game lore that is described as too energetic to contain, too vibrant, with restored life to be kept comfortable in a standard environment. The Pokédex notes that Archon cannot fly yet, despite its wings, and must move through the world by hopping from surface to surface in a way that feels neither fully terrestrial nor aerial. It exists between categories, which is appropriate for a creature representing an evolutionary transition point. Tirtuga and its evolution, Caracosta, the other fossil line of the Unova region, occupy the opposite end of the ancient spectrum. Where Archeops is associated with energy and movement, Caracosta is associated with endurance and weight. The Pokédex describes Caracosta as capable of surviving the crushing pressure of the deep ocean and is old enough in design terms that modern Pokémon taxonomists consider it a foundational sea creature. The contrast between the two fossil lines, one representing ancient aerial life and the other ancient oceanic life, reflects the region's dual landscape of sky roots and water roots without ever making that connection explicit. The relic castle that connects to the desert resort contains layers of history that the game deposits throughout its multi-level structure. The floors descend progressively deeper into the past, with the Pokemon found there shifting toward older and stranger types the lower the player descends. The Volcarona waiting at the very bottom feels earned precisely because reaching it requires moving through so much accumulated time and depth. The castle is presented as a ruin of a ruin, a structure that was ancient when it was built and has since collapsed into something that can barely be called architecture anymore. The desert resort surrounding Relic Castle was once a fertile area before the climate of the region shifted, according to the lore preserved in various NPC conversations and Pokédex entries. The ruins scattered across the desert surface were once buildings of a civilization that no longer exists. The people who once lived there left traces in the Pokémon they created or lived alongside, but the details of who they were and what they believed have mostly been lost. Unova is a region that contains its own archaeology, with most of the answers buried too deep to easily recover. As we drift a little further through these gentle discoveries, the way Unova handles its secondary mythology becomes worth examining. The Swords of Justice, a quartet of legendary Pokemon consisting of Cobalion, Terrakion, Virizion, and Keldeo, were designed with a direct connection to the literary tradition of Alexandre Dumas and the Three Musketeers. Cobalion, Terrakion, and Virizion correspond to Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, the three core members, while Keldeo takes the role of D'Artagnan, the younger arrival who joins and learns from the established group. The parallel is precise enough that each member's personality and type carry echoes of their literary counterpart. Cobalion, as the leader, is steel and fighting, conveying authority and resolve. Terrakion, the most physically powerful, is rock and fighting, conveying raw strength. Virizion, the most graceful and nature-connected, is grass and fighting. The lore connecting the Swords of Justice involves a historical event in which they protected Pokemon from humans who were destroying forests and habitats, an echo of the Pokemon franchise's long-standing environmental themes. But the specific detail that the quartet was designed around a French novel is unusual in the series, which more often draws from mythology, zoology, and Japanese cultural traditions. The Musketeers' connection gives the Swords of Justice a literary quality that makes them feel slightly different from other legendary groups, as though they exist in a story that was already being told long before the games arrived. The forces of nature, Tornadus, Thundurus, and Landorus, draw from a different tradition entirely. Their design is rooted in Japanese folklore, specifically in the concept of wind, thunder, and earth deities that appear in various regional traditions across Japan. In their Therian forms, which were introduced in the sequels, they transform into creature shapes that are more animalistic and less humanoid than their incarnate forms. The two sets of appearances for each member of the trio create an interesting visual split between a design language that feels culturally Japanese and a design language that feels more universal in its creature-based presentation. Landorus, in particular, holds a special status in the trio as the one who mediates between the other two and ensures that their conflicts do not damage the land. Its role as a balance keeper among divine forces mirrors the broader thematic work that N performs among the human characters, suggesting that the game's interest in mediation and harmony operated at multiple levels of its world simultaneously. The musketeer legendary Keldeo was notable for the conditions under which players could unlock its resolute form in the original games. Unlike most Form A changes in Pokémon, Keldeo's transformation required not a held item or a specific location, but a direct interaction between Keldeo and the other Swords of Justice, while the move Secret Sword was involved. The idea that a Pokémon could change its appearance through a learning process, through being taught something by others, gave the form change a narrative dimension that mechanical trigger conditions rarely carry. Meloetta, one of the mythical Pokémon of the Unova region, carried a form change with its own elegant mechanic. In its Aria form, Meloetta is normal and psychic type. When it uses the move Relic Song in battle, it transforms into pirouette form, becoming normal and fighting type. The transformation is styled as a shift between singing and dancing, between vocal performance and physical movement. Meloetta's design is built around classical performance traditions, with its aria form referencing a standing singer and its pirouette form referencing a spinning dancer. The creature's name itself is a musical term for a short melody. Meloetta's backstory within the games describes its song as capable of influencing the emotions of those who hear it, sometimes causing sadness and sometimes joy, depending on its mood when it sings. A Pokémon whose music alters feelings, designed around the art forms most associated with emotional expression in human culture, fits naturally into a game that asks players to think carefully about what they feel and why they feel it. Genesect represents the opposite end of the mythical spectrum in Unova. Where Meloetta is associated with art and performance, Genesect is associated with weaponry and modification. It is described in the Pokédex as an ancient creature that was dug up by Team Plasma and modified with mechanical components, specifically the cannon mounted on its back. The Pokédex notes that the original Genesect, before modification, lived 300 million years ago. Team Plasma's version carries an additional layer of meaning in that context. The organization that sought to separate Pokémon from humans also chose to weaponize one of the oldest creatures that ever lived. The contradiction is built into the design. Genesect's 4 drives, which change the type of its signature move Techno Blast, are presented as interchangeable data units rather than natural evolutionary features. They are accessories, add-ons, modifications. The creature's natural state has been enhanced in a way that cannot be undone without removing the technological components that Team Plasma installed. Genesect exists in a state of permanent modification, which is a quietly unsettling condition for any living creature. As we drift a little deeper, the smaller details of Unova's design begin to accumulate into something that feels like a portrait of a creative team genuinely invested in what they were building. The city of Lacunosa Town, found in the eastern portion of Unova, is surrounded by a wall that the residents never leave after dark. The town's folklore describes a creature from the giant chasm nearby that would emerge at night and steal people away. The town built the wall to protect against this creature and maintained the tradition of staying inside after sunset, long after the danger had faded from living memory. Kyurem, the legendary Pokémon found in the giant chasm, is implied to be the creature from the old stories. The Pokédex entries for Kyurem describe it as encasing the food it catches in ice before eating it, which the old stories about people being stolen away refract through the lens of predation rather than malice. The town's relationship to its own folklore is presented with considerable subtlety. The residents follow the rules without fully understanding why the rules were created, maintaining a tradition of caution in the presence of a danger they can no longer see clearly. That detail of a town organized around a fear that has calcified into custom gives Lacunosa Town a texture that most locations in the games do not have. It feels like a real place with a real history, rather than a backdrop for a story happening elsewhere. The abundance of bridges throughout Unova creates a navigational experience different from most other regions. Players cross water frequently but on foot, above the surface, looking down at routes and towns visible beneath them. This vertical relationship between pathways and the world below them reinforces the sense that Unova is a region where things exist in layers, where what is visible from one level looks different from another. The Marvelous Bridge, one of the most memorable of these, carries an additional layer of detail in a brief encounter with a ghost-like figure who speaks to the player and then disappears, leaving behind a strange item with no explanation. The game never identifies who or what this figure was. The cold storage, a refrigerated warehouse found near Driftvale City, served as a hideout for portions of Team Plasma in the first games and was replaced by Pokémon World Tournament in the sequels. The change from a secret operative base to an international competitive arena reflects the broader shift in tone between the two game pairs. The original Black and White were concerned with urgency and conflict. The sequels, set 2 years later, were concerned with aftermath and continuation. The cold storage's transformation is a small physical record of that tonal shift. Driftvale City's gym leader Clay, who operates a mining operation beneath the city, holds the ground badge and specializes in ground-type Pokémon. His character is built around the idea of a self-made businessman who digs beneath the surface to find what is valuable. The mining themes in his gym, where players navigate shafts and elevators to reach him, create an environment that feels earned through physical effort rather than simply occupied. Reaching Clay requires moving through his work in a way that most gym designs do not demand. The gym leaders of Unova were designed with more elaborate personalities and story roles than was typical for the series at the time. Elesa, the electric-type leader of Nimbasa, was presented as a model and performer whose gym was staged like a fashion runway. Skyla, who commanded flying types from Mistralton City, was designed as a pilot who transported medical supplies by air when she was not battling challengers. Bryson, who led the Ice-type gym in Iciris City, was revealed to be a former movie star who had retired from public life to focus on training. These character details were optional rather than mechanically important, but they gave the gym leaders a sense of existence beyond their function as obstacles. The final gym leader encountered before the Pokemon League, Drayden or Iris depending on the version being played, represented the dragon type in a region whose legendary Pokemon were themselves dragons. The symmetry of a dragon-specialized trainer guarding the entrance to a league anchored by dragon legendaries is structurally deliberate. The player must demonstrate mastery over the same type that defines the region's mythology before being permitted to challenge that mythology directly. As we move a little deeper into the quieter corners of Unova's design, the way the region thinks about evolution as a process becomes one of its more interesting recurring concerns. The Unova Pokémon that were involved in trade-based evolutions carried an unusual number of specific conditions that previous generations had not required. Carablast and Shelmet, for instance, would only evolve if they were traded for each other specifically. Carablast traded for a Shelmet would evolve into Escavalier, gaining the armor that Shelmet shed in the process. Shelmet traded for a Carablast would evolve into Axelgore, freed of its shell and significantly faster for the loss. The exchange is designed to feel like a genuine transaction between two creatures rather than a mechanical trigger with no narrative weight. The lore embedded in this trading mechanic describes an ancient relationship between the two species in the wild, where they would engage in a kind of predatory exchange when they encountered each other. Carablast would steal Shelmet's shell, and both would change as a result. The game mechanic preserves this dynamic in a way that requires two players to participate, making the evolution into a cooperative event rather than a solitary achievement. Electros, the evolved form of electric, holds a distinction in the game's mechanical design that became a topic of considerable discussion among competitive players. Electros has only one ability available to it, Levitate, which negates ground-type moves. This combination of the electric typing, which normally has only one weakness in ground-type moves, with the Levitate ability that removes that single weakness, creates a Pokémon with no type weaknesses at all under normal conditions. It is not the only Pokémon with this property, and it has limitations in practice, but the design choice to create a creature with a sealed defensive profile was a deliberate one that rewarded players who understood type mathematics. Stunfisk, by contrast, is a creature that seems almost designed to confuse expectations. Its appearance is that of a flat, muddy fish lying against the ground. Its typing in the original games combined ground and electric, creating a combination that seemed counterintuitive. Its stats are middling in most categories, but its design was built around the Japanese concept of a flat fish that delivers electric shocks to those who accidentally step on it in shallow water, and its Pokédex entries describe it waiting beneath the surface of muddy water for exactly that opportunity. The creature that seems least impressive at first glance was designed with a very specific ecological niche in mind. Zebstrika, the evolution of Blitzel, carries a design that is unusually minimal for a Pokémon, being essentially a stylized black and white zebra with lightning bolt markings. The simplicity of its design is a choice rather than a limitation. The Pokédex describes Zebstrika as so fast that it creates sonic booms when running at full speed, and the minimal design communicates velocity in a way that more cluttered details might have obscured. The creature looks like something that should be moving, even when it is standing still. The Vanillite line, which was widely criticized by some players upon release for being a Pokémon based on an ice cream cone, was a deliberate provocation in certain ways. The line's designers were aware that a creature built around soft-serve ice cream would generate resistance from players who felt that Pokémon design should be rooted in more naturalistic concepts. But the design team had introduced Pokémon based on everyday human objects as far back as the original generation, with Electrode and Voltorb being based on Pokeballs and Magnemite being based on a magnet. Vanillite's critics were often applying a standard that the series had never consistently maintained. More interesting, perhaps, is the lore embedded in the Vanillite line's existence. The Pokédex describes Vanillish as capable of producing ice crystals from moisture in the air, which it fires at opponents. Vanillix, the final form, has two heads and is described as the product of two Vanillish that froze together when water got inside their snowflake crests. The evolutionary story of two separate creatures bonding permanently into a single organism is unusual and slightly strange in a way that the creature's dessert appearance does not immediately suggest. The Deerling and Sawsbuck line introduced one of the more visually ambitious mechanics of the Unova games, with the creatures changing their appearance based on the current season in the game. All four seasonal forms were available, with the deer changing color and the plant growth on their bodies shifting to reflect spring, summer, autumn, and winter. The mechanic required the game to track the real-world calendar to some degree, connecting the appearance of the creature to the physical time of year outside the game. Players encountered different-looking deerling depending on when they played, which gave the Pokémon a quality of being genuinely embedded in the passage of time. Fungus and Amoonguss, two mushroom Pokémon that disguised themselves as Pokeballs, were the Unova region's answer to a question the franchise had quietly accumulated over many years. Pokeballs exist in enormous quantities throughout the world. The materials required to make them grow in the wild. It would be ecologically strange if no creature had evolved to take advantage of the visual mimicry opportunity that a small round red and white object offers in a landscape full of small, round red and white objects. Fungus and Amoonguss are the result of thinking through what that evolutionary pressure might produce. The Unova games' relationships with doubles battles was more central than in most previous entries in the series. Triple battles and rotation battles were introduced as new formats that required different strategic thinking than the standard one-on-one encounter. Triple battles placed 3 Pokémon on each side simultaneously, creating spatial considerations about which creature could target which opponent based on position. Rotation battles placed 3 Pokémon in a ring, with one facing the opponent at any given moment, and required players to rotate between their 3 options each turn. Both formats added mechanical depth that expanded the strategic space of the game considerably. The musical connection within the Pokémon world has always been strong, but it is worth noting how many musical elements the Unova games embedded in their Pokémon designs. Meloetta has already been discussed, but the Tympole and Palpitoad and Seismitoad line, a family of frog-based creatures, were designed around the concept of music produced through resonance. Seismitoad is described as amplifying the power of its vibrations using the bumps on its body, using that amplified energy as both a weapon and a means of communication. The creature is a percussion instrument shaped like a frog. Audino, the normal type encountered throughout the Unova routes, is designed as a creature that functions almost as a medical professional within the Pokémon world. Its ears contain feelers that allow it to listen to the internal sounds of other creatures' bodies, monitoring heartbeats and other vital rhythms to determine their condition. The Pokédex entries describe Audino using these feelers to diagnose illness in other Pokémon. The creature occupies a role that most games in the series had given to human characters rather than the Pokémon themselves, suggesting a world where some creatures have developed specialized functions within the broader ecosystem rather than simply existing in their wild habitats. The Pokestar Studios, introduced in Pokémon Black 2 and White 2, allowed players to participate in the creation of small films within the game. The studio was built where the plasma frigate had once been anchored, another example of the games using geography to mark the passage of time. The films produced at Pokestar Studios could be watched afterward and would feature the player's team. Unusual endings could be triggered by specific battle conditions, and the crowd reactions to those unusual endings were different from the standard responses. A player who deliberately achieved a bad ending for a film might find the audience's reaction to be more enthusiastic than the response to a conventional victory, which was the game commenting quietly on the appeal of unexpected outcomes. Nimbasa City's sports venues, the baseball stadium, and the football stadium where the gym was embedded, suggested an Unova that had organized athletics on a large scale. The sports existed in the world, implied by the infrastructure dedicated to them, without the games doing anything mechanical with that implication. Players walked through stadiums that were used for things other than Pokemon battles, which reinforced the sense that the Pokemon world had its own culture and recreation beyond the trainer journey. The musical theaters of Nimbasa connected to this cultural life in a more direct, mechanical way. Players could dress their Pokemon in accessories and then watch them perform on stage, with the audience responding to how well the accessories matched the performance's theme. The mechanic did not affect battle performance. It existed purely as expression, as play within the game, as a way for the game to acknowledge that its world contained activities that were not about competition or conflict. The care that went into designing Unova's secondary culture reflects a development team that was thinking about its region as a place where people lived rather than simply a series of obstacles for the player to overcome. That quality is one of the reasons the Unova games have grown in estimation over the years since their release. At the time, some players found the region's density and its focus on story over open exploration to be restrictions. In retrospect, that density and focus are part of what makes Unova feel fully realized in a way that is genuinely unusual for the series. The debate about which starter Pokemon to choose in Black and White was shaped by a detail that players discovered over time. The three starters, Snivy, Tepig, and Oshawott, were designed with their final evolution's typings in mind, in a way that connected to the traditional rock-paper-scissors dynamic, but also extended beyond it. Emboar, Tepig's final evolution, was the third consecutive fire and fighting final starter evolution in the series, following Infernape and Blaziken. Some players felt this represented a creative limitation. Others pointed out that the type combination remained effective and that the individual designs were distinct enough to stand apart from each other despite sharing a dual typing. Serperior, Snivy's final evolution, was designed to reference European royalty in its bearing and the foliage surrounding its body, taking the grass snake concept through a process of increasing formality until it became something that looked genuinely aristocratic. The creature's design is long and minimal, a quality that gives it a different kind of presence from most grass-type final evolutions, which tend toward larger and more elaborate forms. Samurott, Oshawott's final evolution, represents one of the more unexpected design journeys in Unova's starter line. Oshawott is a small, round, domestic-seeming creature. Dewott, its intermediate form, begins the transition towards something more martial. Samurott is a large, quadrupedal sea lion wearing armored segments that can be drawn as scimitars in battle, essentially functioning as a warrior that carries its weapons on its body. The leap from the gentle Oshawott to the armored Samurott is considerable, and the journey there traces a story of progressive training and transformation that the design illustrates without requiring any text to explain. The Unova games also introduced a greater number of single-stage Pokemon than previous generations, creatures designed to exist without evolving further. Bouffalant, Basculin, Alomomola, Sigilyph, and others were designed as complete species rather than as the beginning of a progression. This choice was partly practical, allowing the designers to fill certain ecological niches without committing to a full evolutionary line for each one. But it also reflected a design philosophy that some creatures should simply be what they are, with no implication that what they are is insufficient or incomplete. Sigilyph, in particular, is a creature whose design draws from ancient symbolic art in a way that gives it an alien quality, unlike most other Pokemon. Its geometric body and floating eyes suggest an ancient pictograph or petroglyph that has somehow come to life, and the Pokédex confirms this connection by describing it as a creature that patrols the paths it memorized when an ancient civilization used it as a guardian. The civilization is gone. The paths may no longer exist in their original form, but Sigilif continues flying its remembered route, not because it has been instructed to, but because the memory of that instruction is all it has. That image of a creature defined by the memory of a vanished purpose is quietly one of the most melancholy in the franchise. Sigilif cannot learn a new role because it does not know the civilization that created it no longer needs guarding. It simply continues. That kind of purposeful persistence without awareness is something the game leaves open-ended, and it is more affecting for the space it occupies. The credits sequence of Pokémon Black and White used a montage format that was unusual for the series, showing the player's journey alongside images of the world as it had been affected by the story's events. N's departure on Reshiram or Zekrom, depending on version, flying toward the horizon in the game's final moment, was designed as an open ending rather than a conclusion. He was not defeated. He was not reformed in a conventional sense. He changed his understanding and chose to leave, taking his legendary partner with him to continue thinking about the questions the game had raised without resolving them. That willingness to leave a question open, to let a character walk away into uncertainty rather than resolve cleanly, was part of what distinguished Black and White from other entries in the series at the time. The game trusted its players to sit with an unanswered question without needing it to be answered, which is a kind of respect that games do not always offer. The music that played over those credits was designed to feel like a quiet ending and a quiet beginning simultaneously, which matched the emotional register the game had been building toward. A world where truth and ideals are not resolved into each other, but held in tension, where N flies away without arriving at a final destination, where a young trainer stands at the end of one journey that has quietly become the beginning of another. That feeling of something that has ended and something that continues is what Unova does best. The Unova region, with all its hidden meanings and its careful design and its quiet insistence on taking its own story seriously, remains one of the more fully realized places the Pokémon franchise has ever created. The bridges that cross its waterways, the names that carry meanings no one announces, the characters whose damage is embedded in their design rather than explained in their dialogue, the legendary dragons that embody questions rather than answers, all of these are the elements of a region that was made to be returned to be looked at again from a slightly different angle and find something that was always there but had not been noticed yet. There is a particular quality to the way Unova handles the concept of transformation that sets it apart from other Pokémon regions. Every region changes its creatures through evolution, but Unova seems specifically preoccupied with what transformation costs and what it preserves. The story of N is a story about a person being transformed by his circumstances and then choosing to transform himself again through understanding. The story of the Tau Trio is a story about a single original dragon that divided into 3 incomplete expressions of what it once was. The story of Team Plasma is a story about an organization that transformed a genuine philosophical concern about the relationship between Pokémon and humans into a tool for power, and then fractured when that transformation was exposed. Even the landscape of Unova participates in this theme. The Twist Mountain that connects the western and eastern halves of the region is described as a place where the strata of rock reveal different eras of geological time, each layer a record of a transformation that took millions of years. The Pokémon living within its caverns include ancient species that have remained largely unchanged since very old periods of the world's history. Boldore, Woobat, Girder, and Cryogonal all make their homes there, each one contributing to an underground ecosystem that the surface world rarely thinks about. Cryogonal, in particular, is a creature whose design reads as an abstraction. It is a large snowflake, geometric and symmetric, with chains of ice hanging from its body that it uses to capture prey by lowering the ambient temperature of its surroundings until the prey cannot move. The Pokédex describes it as born from snow clouds during winter and returning to a snow cloud when it melts, suggesting that the creature exists as a temporary solidification of a larger atmospheric phenomenon. It is not so much a creature as a moment in the water cycle given temporary form. That quality of existing temporarily, of being a state rather than a permanent entity, connects Cryogonal to several other Unova Pokémon that seem to exist at the boundary of solidity. Solosis and the evolution into Reuniclus presents a creature that appears to be a cell, something visible under a microscope, magnified to an unusual scale. The protective fluid surrounding it is described as so potent that even nuclear attacks would not harm the creature within it. The image of something completely soft and vulnerable surviving intact inside a shell of its own making is one the Unova region returns to in multiple forms. The Gothita and Litwick lines were both introduced in Unova and represent very different approaches to the psychic and ghost-type traditions the series had established in previous generations. Gothita, which evolves into Gotharita and then Gothitelle, is described as a creature that gazes at something invisible to human eyes. Its stare is fixed on something that cannot be perceived by those around it. Gothitelle's Pokédex entries describe it as able to predict the future by reading the stars, and is capable of distorting space around it when it senses the approach of its own death. A creature that can distort reality in response to its own mortality is operating at a level of cosmic engagement that its simple visual design does not immediately announce. Litwick, which evolves into Lampent and then Chandelure, begins its evolutionary journey as a small candle whose flame is described as a soul that has been lured in and is being slowly consumed. The creature looks gentle and small. Its flame is soft. The Pokédex notes that its guiding light leads travelers astray so that it can feed on the life force they lose when they become lost in the dark. The visual presentation is warm and the behavior is predatory, which is a combination the ghost type has always managed well, but Litwick executes it at a very small and personal scale that makes it feel more intimate than most ghost types. The relationship between Litwick and Chandelure illustrates something interesting about how Unova managed its evolutionary lines. The jump from a small candle to an ornate chandelier requires imagination to bridge, and the game never explicitly explains how that transformation occurs mechanically. It simply presents the end state and leaves the in-between space as something the player fills in themselves. That willingness to ask the imagination to do work is part of what gives the Unova designs an open quality that rewards time spent thinking about them. Jellicent, the evolution of Frillish, exists at the surface of the ocean. Its design is built around Victorian formal wear applied to a jellyfish, creating a creature that looks like something from a costume party happening very slowly underwater. The male and female versions differ in color and expression in a way that suggests two different personalities inhabiting the same basic design. The Pokédex entries for Jellicent describe ships that have sunk in its territory, noting that it sucks the life force from anyone who falls into the water near it, and that the wreckage of these ships now forms its palace on the ocean floor. A creature living in a palace, built from the ships it has destroyed, has a scale of activity that its cheerful appearance does not communicate at first glance. The Frillish and Jellicent line is one of several in Unova that presents dramatically different visual versions of the same creature based on gender. Unfezant, the evolution of Paidovi and Tranquil, has male and female versions with significantly different appearances, the male being notably more colorful and ornate. Basculin exists in red-striped and blue-striped forms that inhabit different bodies of water and are described as being in constant conflict with each other when their territories overlap. The region seemed particularly interested in the idea of a single species expressing itself in multiple distinct ways, depending on factors outside the creature's control. The lake outside La Canosa town, the giant chasm, holds a specific quality of cold that the game describes as emanating from the frozen interior of the location, regardless of season. In the winter, the giant chasm's interior becomes especially cold, affecting which Pokémon appear there. Kyurem lives at its center, described in the Pokédex as generating a powerful cold by freezing its own body and crouching inside the chasm. The image of a legendary Pokémon freezing itself in order to endure is a quietly self-destructive one, suggesting that Kyurem's emptiness has made it willing to damage itself simply to maintain a state of stillness. The design of Kyurem was specifically intended to feel incomplete, and the design team succeeded in that intention. The creature has visible gaps and asymmetries in its body that suggest structural damage or deterioration. Its wings appear too large and ragged for efficient flight. Its body seems to have portions that are not properly sealed, with ice-filling spaces that should perhaps contain something else. The visual vocabulary of incompleteness was applied to Kyurem's design with more deliberateness than most Pokémon receive, making it readable as lacking even before the player learns the lore that explains the feeling. The black and white Kyurem forms, achieved through the DNA splicers, draw the design of Zekrom and Reshiram into Kyurem's frame in ways that are explicitly visible. Black Kyurem has Zekrom's turbine tail incorporated into its body. White Kyurem has Reshiram's engine-like components appearing in its structure. The fusion is not clean. Elements appear borrowed and slightly mismatched, as though two different creatures are occupying one space without fully integrating. This visual quality of imperfect fusion reinforces the lore that these forms represent a temporary reconnection rather than a genuine restoration of what was originally lost. The concept of original forms and deviated forms that Unova introduced with the Tau Trio extended into later games, but had its roots in the region's specific mythology. The idea that Pokémon can exist in a changed version of themselves, different from how they were initially designed or born, ran through multiple design choices in the generation. Meloetta's form changed based on a move, Kyurem's fusion forms, Genesect's drive-based modifications, Deerling's seasonal shifts. The region was consistently asking questions about what makes a creature itself when its form can change. Zorua and Zoroark, the illusion Pokémon of the Unova region, took this theme of changed form in a different direction entirely. Rather than a creature that transforms itself, these creatures project false images of other things for others to perceive. Zoroark's illusions are sophisticated enough that the Pokédex describes them as capable of projecting an entirely fake landscape rather than just a fake creature, affecting the perceptions of everyone nearby simultaneously. A Pokémon that can alter the reality perceived by others, not through magic, but through the projection of convincing false information, carries a philosophical weight about the nature of what we accept as true. The move illusion, Zoroark's signature ability, caused considerable discussion among competitive players upon its introduction. The ability makes Zoroark appear to be the last Pokémon in the player's party when it enters battle, disguising itself as a different creature until it is hit. The strategy is built around misdirection, leading an opponent to make choices based on false information about what they are actually facing. This mechanic is one of the few in the series that directly rewards players for understanding and exploiting the assumptions their opponents will make, which is an unusual kind of cleverness for a main series game to incentivize. The reveal of Zorua ahead of the events of the film, Zoroark Master of Illusions, was handled through a special event distribution that was unusual in how it was presented to players. A specific event Celebi, when transferred to Pokémon Black and White, triggered an encounter with a young Zorua hiding in Castelia City. The creature was disguising itself as a human child, specifically as the player character's rival. Finding it required talking to what appeared to be a person standing in an unusual location and then watching the illusion drop. The event was designed to make the player momentarily uncertain about whether they were looking at a Pokémon or a human, which is exactly the kind of experience that Zorua's design asks for. Castelia City itself was designed to feel overwhelming in a way that no previous Pokémon city had attempted. Its skyscraper scale, its multiple piers extending into the ocean, its narrow streets full of pedestrians, and its variety of businesses scattered across multiple interconnected streets created an urban density that players had not encountered before in the series. The gym was located within the city, but required exploration to find, embedded among other buildings rather than presented as the obvious focal point. The city existed before the gym and around the gym, which made it feel like a real place where people lived rather than a setting arranged primarily for the player's convenience. The Pokémon musicals that Nimbasa City hosted allowed players to dress their Pokémon in hats, accessories, and props sourced from a growing collection, and then submit those dressed Pokémon to a performance. The audience would react based on how well the accessories matched the performance's theme, with certain combinations generating stronger responses than others. The mechanic required no battle skill and no strategic thinking. It was pure curation, a test of whether the player understood the aesthetic vocabulary of each performance category well enough to select the right combination of accessories. The game rewarded attention to style in a space where no other kind of reward was on offer. The Royal Unova, a cruise ship that could be boarded in the evening from Castelia City's pier, offered a set of optional battles and a small prize for defeating enough trainers before the ship returned to port. The event was time-limited, requiring players to move quickly rather than methodically, but the ship itself, moving slowly along the coast of Unova in the evening light, created a quiet sense of the region as something that could be experienced from a distance, looked at from the water, rather than always navigated from within. Seeing familiar skylines from the ocean gave the region a geography that existed beyond the routes the player normally walked. The various Unova routes each contained a small ecosystem of their own with specific weather conditions, specific terrain features, and specific groups of Pokémon that lived together in ways that implied a relationship between them. Route 6, for instance, was a route with seasonal Pokémon variations and a small amount of tall grass alongside a body of water, creating a junction where land and water species existed near each other. The seasons mechanic in Black 2 and White 2 affected how this and many other routes looked and what appeared in them, with snow covering previously green areas and ice forming on water surfaces in winter. The season system was one of the more ambitious environmental features the games attempted. Each season lasted one real-world month, and some Pokémon appeared only in specific seasons. Some areas were accessible only during specific seasons, blocked by terrain that could only be traversed when conditions were right. Icera City, the home of the Ice-type gym, became dramatically more accessible during winter when the surrounding marshland froze. In other seasons, navigating to Iceris required more effort. The The world responded to time in a way that made it feel genuinely alive rather than perpetually static. Twist Mountain, where the transition between the western and eastern portions of Unova occurred, contained a seasonal detail that many players missed. In the winter version of the mountain's interior, a hiker could be found who would give the player a fossil Pokémon that was unavailable elsewhere. The encounter was only possible during the specific real-world month of winter, meaning players who never played during that time would simply never know it was there unless someone told them. The design philosophy behind these hidden, seasonal encounters reflects a broader commitment to rewarding players who return to the game repeatedly over time. A single continuous playthrough could not reveal everything the Unova region contained. Some things required waiting or returning at different times, or knowing in advance that specific months carried specific opportunities. This design choice created a relationship between the player and the game that was fundamentally different from the relationship most previous Pokémon games had asked for. Unova was not a place to be completed and set aside. It was a place to be revisited. The Friends Safari feature and Join Avenue in the sequels extended this revisiting quality into the social dimension. Players who connected with others through the game's wireless features would unlock access to areas and encounters that solo play could not provide. The game's world was designed to expand based on community, making it larger for players who were connected and smaller for those who played alone. This created a gentle incentive toward connection without making the solo experience feel inadequate, which is a difficult balance to maintain. The Black Tower and White Tree Hollow, the major challenge dungeons introduced in the sequels, represented the game's most demanding encounters for players who had completed the main story and wanted extended testing for their teams. The Black Tower, exclusive to Black 2, was a series of floors that grew progressively harder, with trainers using increasingly powerful teams. The White Tree Hollow, exclusive to White 2, offered the same structure with a different visual presentation. Both dungeons were designed to occupy players who had finished the story and wanted something that would push their teams to their limits. The Pokémon World Tournament, which occupied the location where cold storage had been in the original games, brought trainers from previous Pokémon regions together in a competitive setting. Gym leaders and champions from Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, and Sinnoh could all be challenged in various tournament formats. This feature was the series' most explicit acknowledgement up to that point that all the previous regions existed within the same world, that the trainers encountered in previous games were real people with ongoing lives, rather than memories confined to past titles. Battling Misty from Kanto or Lance from Johto in the Pokémon World Tournament changed the emotional register of those characters. They were no longer just characters from an old game. They were people who had continued growing and training in the years since the player had last encountered them. Cynthia, who also appeared in the Undella Town Villa across both pairs of games, represented this continuous existence most fully. She was a champion who spent her downtime at a vacation property in a different region, studying ruins and mythology, conducting a life that extended well beyond her role as a final boss in a previous game. The music theme associated with Cynthia's appearances in the Unova games used elements of her original theme from Sinnoh while transforming them into something that felt like memory. The familiar melody in a new arrangement created a sense of time passing, of the same person heard at a different moment in her life. That kind of musical continuity, where a character's theme evolves alongside the character, is one of the more sophisticated uses of the series' musical vocabulary. Unova's soundtrack as a whole was built on a foundation of dynamic responsiveness that created a different listening experience from previous games. The way tracks shifted during critical moments of the story, the way certain locations had musical themes that changed between day and night, The way the legendary battle themes were structured to feel mythologically significant rather than simply exciting all contributed to a sonic environment that matched the game's narrative ambitions. The legendary battle theme for Reshiram and Zekrom, specifically, was composed to feel enormous, to carry a weight that communicated the significance of the moment without requiring dialogue to explain it. Players who encountered these creatures in the final areas of the game would hear music that felt genuinely proportional to what they were facing. That proportionality between musical register and narrative significance was something that Unova games managed more consistently than most entries in the series. The White Forest and Black City, exclusive areas in the original games, represented complementary extremes of the urban natural spectrum. Black City was a dense, developed urban area that grew larger and more populated the more players engaged with it through wireless communication. White Forest was a woodland area full of wild Pokémon and trainers who were absent from the Black game's equivalent. The two areas were literal reflections of the game's thematic priorities, with Black version offering its exclusive area as urban development, and White version offering its exclusive area as natural preservation. This parallel between thematic content and version exclusivity was more deliberate than the simple version exclusives the series had always used. It made the choice between Black and White versions feel like a genuine philosophical preference rather than an arbitrary product differentiation. Players who preferred the idea of nature preservation found one answer in White Forest. Players who preferred the image of urban expansion found a different answer in Black City. The choice remained small in mechanical terms, but it felt meaningful in a way that choosing between Squirtle and Bulbasaur had never quite managed. The development of Pokémon Black and White took place across a period when the franchise was being extensively discussed in terms of its future. Some commentary at the time suggested that Pokémon needed to change significantly to remain relevant, that the formula was exhausted, that the audience had grown past it. Masuda and the team responded by creating a game that took its story more seriously than any previous entry, that built its world with unusual thematic deliberateness, and that made the player's choices feel genuinely weighted in ways that previous games had not attempted. The result was a generation that was divisive on release and beloved in retrospect. Players who wanted the traditional Pokémon experience found Unova's emphasis on story and linearity frustrating. Players who wanted the series to say something found exactly what they were looking for. The decade that followed the game's release saw a steady reassessment that moved the Unova games from their initially divisive status to a position of significant appreciation among long-term fans of the series. That reassessment was supported by the generation's longevity as a cultural reference point. N, in particular, became one of the most discussed characters the franchise had ever produced, inspiring fan creativity that continued years after the game's release. The questions he embodied about the ethics of keeping Pokémon, about the validity of different ways of relating to living creatures, about what it means to have one's understanding of the world constructed by someone with an agenda, were questions that did not resolve cleanly and therefore remained interesting to think about long after the credits had rolled. The lingering quality of N's story, the fact that it stayed with people rather than dissipating, is evidence that the writers had done something unusual. They had built a character whose situation raised questions that the medium itself was not fully equipped to answer. A game about capturing and training Pokémon, asking whether capturing and training Pokémon is ethical while providing no definitive resolution to that question, creates a kind of thoughtful dissonance that is rare in games designed for a broad audience. The final confrontation at N's castle, where Ghetsis' manipulation is exposed, and N is forced to see the person who built his worldview as a person who used him, is structured as a series of conversations rather than simply a sequence of battles. The player witnesses the exchange between N and Getsis, but cannot intervene. The dialogue plays out at its own pace. The game asks the player to watch something difficult happen to a character they have come to know, without being able to protect that character from what they are learning. That choice to make the player a witness rather than an agent in that specific moment is a structurally mature decision that few games aimed at the same audience would have made. What follows, the final battle with N, is one of the few times in the main series where the final legendary confrontation is framed as a conversation between equals rather than a conquest. N does not want to destroy the player. He wants to prove something, and the outcome of the battle does not simply defeat him, it changes him. That change is not dramatic or immediately visible. But the player who reaches the credits and watches N fly away on his legendary dragon understands that something has shifted in the world, even if the exact nature of that shift remains open. The Unova region will carry that quality of openness forward into whatever form its next official appearance takes. The mysteries embedded in its design, the meanings waiting in its names, the history implied by its ruins and its ancient towers, and its frozen legendary sleeping in a chasm outside a town that built walls against the fear of it. All of this belongs to a place that was made with care and made to last. The Pokémon of Unova that occupy its water roots carry a particular richness of design that rewards thinking about them as a complete ecosystem rather than as individual creatures encountered separately. A Lamamola, the caring Pokémon found on the open water routes, is described in its Pokédex entries as wrapping injured Pokémon in its healing membrane and then swimming side by side with them until they recover, sometimes traveling enormous distances to ensure their recovery is complete. The creature cannot evolve and exists in its final form from the moment it is encountered, which means all the care it offers, the world is given without the possibility of becoming something else first. That quality of being complete and giving without anticipation of transformation is unusual in a region where so much of the design is concerned with what things become. Basculin, found throughout Unova's rivers and lakes, exists in two forms that are in constant conflict with each other. The red-striped form and the blue-striped form share the same general design and the same ecological niche, but are described as being aggressively territorial when they encounter each other. Two versions of the same basic creature, visually distinguished only by the color of their markings, fighting over the same water, suggests a portrait of conflict that is essentially groundless. There is no biological reason the two forms cannot coexist. The conflict is described as historical and habitual, maintained because it has always been maintained, rather than because it serves any purpose. That kind of conflict, perpetuated by tradition rather than genuine need, appears nowhere in the game's text as a moral lesson, but it sits there quietly for any player who thinks about it. Swana, the evolution of Ducklet, is a creature designed around the ballet tradition in a way that does not announce itself immediately. Its white plumage and graceful posture recall the classical image of the swan from Performance, and its Pokédex entries describe it performing an elegant dance at dusk before sleeping. A water bird that dances before sleeping, that finds a moment of expression and beauty before the night takes it, is a gentle concept embedded in a standard water and flying type Pokémon that players would encounter relatively early in their Unova journey. The Axew family, culminating in Haxorus, represents a different kind of dragon than most the series had offered before. Where Dragonite and Salamence carried bulk and scale, Haxorus is built around concentrated destructive force in a compact form. Its tusks are described as capable of slicing through steel. The Pokédex notes that despite their tremendous strength, they are docile, and that when their tusks are broken, they grow back quickly. A creature of extraordinary destructive power that chooses not to use that power indiscriminately, that is patient and calm by nature rather than disposition, is a useful counterpoint to the legendary dragons that dominate the region's mythology. Haxorus says something different than Reshiram and Zekrom say, something about what power looks like when it is carried without agenda. The Dino family, leading to Hydreigon, is built around a mythology of escalating danger. Dano is blind at birth, navigating by biting everything in its path. Zweilous has 2 heads that fight each other for food. Hydreigon has 3 heads and is described in the Pokédex as having 2 of them effectively mindless, acting purely on violent instinct, while the central head provides the only conscious direction. The 3-stage escalation from blindly biting to internally conflicted to partly uncontrollable violence describes a creature whose development moves toward increasing complexity and increasing danger simultaneously. The Pokédex describes Hydreigon as uncontrollable and not accepting of any trainer, which is an unusual thing to say about a creature that players can in fact train and battle with. The Larvesta and Volcarona line closes the regional decks in a way that circles back to Alder, the champion, and the mythological sun imagery that defines Volcarona's place in the world. Larvesta is described as born from fire in the volcanoes of ancient times, with its horns releasing fire that drives away enemies. It hatches from an egg said to be kept warm by the fires of Volcarona, connecting the pre-evolved form directly to the parent creature's solar mythology. The line is presented as something that exists in a kind of mythological continuity rather than simply as a caterpillar that becomes a moth. The caterpillar already carries the memory of what it will become, already exists within the story its final form is telling. The way Unova's Dex ends on Genesect and Meloetta, the 2 final mythical Pokémon, places 2 very different design philosophies side by side. Meloetta, the artist, and Genesect, the weapon. One exists to express, and the other exists to destroy. Both were created by humans in different ways and for different purposes. The pairing is not accidental. A region that spent its entire story asking questions about the relationship between humans and Pokémon closes with 2 creatures that represent the extremes of that relationship, the worst and best of what humans do when they apply their creativity to the living world. The Unova region's willingness to carry that level of thematic weight through to its final entries is evidence of a creative team that maintained its intentions across the full scope of the project. It would have been easy to introduce 156 new Pokémon and let the later ones be defined simply by their mechanics and their visual appeal. Instead, the thematic concerns of the region appear in the final entries as clearly as they appear in the boxed legendaries and the starter Pokémon. Everything was considered. Everything was placed with awareness of what it was placed beside. That quality of comprehensive intentionality is what separates the Unova games from most of their contemporaries and from many entries in the series itself. It is also what makes them worth returning to, worth examining carefully, worth spending quiet time with long after the story has been completed and the credits have rolled and the lights have gone down. The details that remain in the dark when the screen goes quiet are the details that built Unova. The name meanings, the design histories, the small errors in the sprites, the staircases that spiral different numbers of times depending on who waits at the top, the bridges that stand for something larger than themselves, the legendary dragons that embody questions the world has not yet finished asking. These are the quiet marks left by people who cared about what they were making, who believed that the player on the other side of the screen deserved something that would last. It is worth lingering one final time on what the Unova games communicated about the act of playing Pokémon itself. Most Pokémon games ask the player to become the best, to defeat every obstacle, to collect every creature, to stand on top of every hierarchy the game presents. Black and White asked a slightly different question. They asked the player to become a person who understood what they were doing, who had thought about the relationship between strength and purpose, who had encountered someone with a genuinely different worldview, and had been changed by the encounter, even if not converted by it. N's final words before he departs with his legendary partner do not concede defeat. He says that his way of thinking may have been wrong, but that the relationship between people and Pokémon is something that still needs to be considered carefully by everyone involved in it. That acknowledgement of continued uncertainty from a character who had been entirely certain for the whole game is a moment of genuine emotional intelligence embedded in a children's game about collecting creatures. The willingness to end on a note of productive uncertainty rather than comfortable resolution is part of what defines the Unova games as something worth coming back to. The story does not tell the player what to think. It gives them things to think about and then lets them rest with those things in whatever way feels right. That is perhaps the most appropriate quality for a game to carry into the late hours, when the room is quiet and the screen is beginning to blur at the edges of attention. Questions that do not demand answers, details that do not demand recognition. A world that continues existing whether or not it is being observed. The bridges of Unova are still standing in the dark. The frozen chasm still holds what it has always held. The ancient tower still remembers what slept inside it. These things continue without needing a player to make them continue. They were built to last, and they have. There is one more thing worth noting before silence takes over completely, and it belongs to the way Unova thinks about memory. The creatures of Unova that are most defined by what they remember: Sigilif patrolling a forgotten path, Kyurem waiting for someone who may never arrive, Yamask grieving the face it used to wear. All of them carry their memories as both a burden and a purpose. Memory in Unova is not simply information stored. It is the thing that keeps a creature moving when the original reason for moving is gone. It is the habit of meaning that persists after meaning's source has dissolved. Players who return to Unova years after their first visit find themselves in a similar position. The games carry the memories of those first playthroughs inside them, in the save data if it still exists, and in the player's own mind if it does not. Walking through Castelia City again, after time has passed and other regions have been visited, is a different experience than walking through it for the first time. The city is the same, the player is different, and that gap between the remembered version and the present version is itself a kind of meaning that the games make available without asking for it. The Unova region was made to be carried around like that, made to become part of the archive of experiences that players bring to each new thing they encounter. Its designs, and its story, and its music, and its quiet details were all arranged to last long enough to become something other than a game. They became a place people returned to in their imaginations, a geography of memory as much as a geography of pixels. There is a particular quality to the music of Unova that most players absorbed without fully realizing they were absorbing it. The soundtrack of Pokémon Black and White was composed primarily by Go Ichinos and Shota Kageyama, and the two approached their work with an awareness that the game's thematic ambitions required music that could carry weight across long stretches of story. Earlier Pokémon games had soundtracks built for immediate impression, for melodies that players would remember after a single encounter. The Unova soundtrack was built for something slightly different. It was built to accumulate. The tracks did not announce themselves loudly. They settled in, and then they stayed. The dynamic battle music introduced in Black and White was one of the more quietly revolutionary decisions the series had made in years. For the first time, the music responded to the conditions of the battle itself. When a trainer's final Pokémon dropped into low health, the tempo and texture of the battle theme would shift, introducing tension without any text on screen having to explain that the situation was serious. The music communicated urgency directly, bypassing language and arriving in the player's nervous system through sound alone. That responsiveness made the music feel alive rather than looped. The Castelia City theme occupies a specific emotional register that is difficult to describe precisely but easy to recognize. It captures the sensation of arriving somewhere larger and more complex than anywhere you have been before, of a city that does not organize itself around your convenience, but expects you to find your own way within it. The track has a jazz-adjacent quality, with a walking bass line and a melodic structure that suggests movement and variety. It was designed to feel like a place that had its own rhythms long before the player arrived and would continue having them long after the player left. Nimbasa City's theme sits at the opposite end of the emotional spectrum from Castelia. Where Castelia feels dense and purposeful, Nimbasa feels bright and celebratory, a city built around entertainment and joy rather than commerce and consequence. The theme is faster, more playful, with a brightness that fits a location built around amusement parks, musical theaters, and sports stadiums. The two city themes sit a short walk apart on the Unova map, but they feel like they belong to different emotional worlds, which is exactly right for a region built on the coexistence of very different things. The legendary battle theme for Reshiram and Zekrom was built to feel enormous without feeling aggressive. Most legendary battle themes in the series use tempo and volume to create a sense of danger, of something powerful bearing down on the player. The Unova theme for these encounters takes a different approach. It builds slowly, with a sense of reverence that mirrors the way the encounters themselves are framed by the story. The player's not simply fighting a legendary Pokémon. They are standing at the center of a mythology that has been moving toward this moment for thousands of years. The music communicates that scale without overstatement. The champion's theme from Black and White has a structural quality that rewards careful listening. It was composed for a champion, Alder, who represents something different from most previous champions in the series. Alder is not defined by dominance. He is defined by experience and by loss. His signature partner died, and he has been wandering since, questioning his own purpose as a trainer. The music for his battle carries both grandeur and melancholy, a combination that suits a character who holds the highest position in the region, but holds it without certainty about what that position means. The themes for the Celestial Tower, a location in the middle of Unova where trainers come to grieve Pokémon who have died, stand apart from almost everything else in the game's musical vocabulary. The Celestial Tower theme is one of the quietest pieces of music the franchise had produced up to that point. It uses minimal instrumentation, with long, sustained notes and a tempo that seems almost reluctant to move forward. Playing through the Celestial Tower required listening to that music across multiple floors, and the effect of it by the time the player reached the bell at the top was cumulative. The sadness had built across the climb. As we drift a little further into the sonic world of Unova, the themes associated with N deserve particular attention. N has two distinct musical identities in the game. His approach music, the track that plays when he appears in the overworld, is light and unusual, built around a music box-like quality that suggests something childlike and slightly off-center. The notes are arranged in a way that does not quite follow expected melodic patterns, as though the music itself is playing by rules that are almost familiar, but not quite. That quality of almost familiarity is exactly right for a character who has learned many things, but has been kept away from the full context of what he learned. N's battle theme is a different matter entirely. It is one of the most ambitious pieces of music in the franchise at the point of its creation, built around a long and complex structure that unfolds over several minutes without simply repeating. The theme has a sense of genuine conflict within it, not the conflict of opposition, but the conflict of a person arguing with themselves. The music feels like it is trying to resolve into something and not quite getting there, which mirrors the situation of the battle itself, where two people who are not truly enemies are nonetheless compelled to fight. The end credits sequence of Pokémon Black and White used music that was designed as a quiet arrival rather than a triumphant conclusion. The track that plays over the credits is gentle and reflective, with a melody that feels like it is looking back at the journey rather than celebrating its completion. This choice was deliberate. The game ends on an open note, with N departing and the world's questions unanswered, and the music mirrors that openness. A grand orchestral fanfare would have lied about what the game had just said. The quiet credits theme told the truth. The music for Team Plasma's encounters throughout the game changed depending on the context, with administrative battles using a different theme from the Grunt's encounters and the Sage's appearances carrying a different register again. This differentiation within a single villainous organization was unusual, and it reinforced the game's interest in treating Team Plasma not as a monolithic evil, but as an organization with different kinds of participants, some of whom were true believers, some of whom were opportunists, and some of whom were somewhere in between. As we drift into a slightly different perspective on Unova, the ways the region handled its geography of emotion begin to reveal themselves as a design decision made with unusual care. Every major city in Unova was designed to feel like a response to a specific kind of human need or human activity. Accumula Town, the first real settlement the player enters, is small and defined by a central square, the kind of place where people gather to hear speeches and announcements. It is there that the player first encounters N and Team Plasma, making their argument to the townspeople. The choice to hold that first ideological confrontation in a town whose name suggests accumulation, the gathering of things and people and ideas, is a quiet design choice that rewards thinking about. Nakreen City was designed around a museum and a warehouse district that had been converted into residences and creative spaces. The city carries the feeling of a place that has found new uses for old structures, where the past has been preserved and repurposed rather than demolished. The gym within Nakreen is housed inside the museum itself, which means that challenging the gym requires walking past exhibits about Pokémon fossils and ancient history. The battle with Lenora happens surrounded by knowledge of what Pokémon were before they were what they are now, which is appropriate for a game concerned with the relationship between the present moment and the long history that precedes it. Striaton City, among the earliest cities the player visits, contains a gym built around a restaurant. The three gym leaders, Ceylon, Chili, and Cress, are styled as waiters and sommeliers, using fire, water, and grass types that correspond to the starter type advantages. The framing of a Pokémon gym as a restaurant, where the aesthetic of hospitality has been applied to competition, creates a tone for early Unova that is playful and a little theatrical. The city establishes that Unova takes its leisure seriously, and that the line between entertainment and challenge is deliberately blurred here. Driftvale City sits at the edge of a drawbridge that connects the western and eastern parts of the region, and its character is shaped by that liminal position. It is a trading city, a place where goods move between different parts of Unova, and where Clay, who mines for resources beneath the city, has built an economic empire based on what can be extracted from the earth. The drawbridge that guards it, operated by a character named Alder's rival Sharon later, and by Clay's influence earlier, creates a sense that access to Driftvale is conditional, that the city maintains its own rules about who enters and when. Mistralton City is defined by its airport, a feature unusual enough in the Pokémon world that it gives the city an international quality that most Pokémon locations do not have. The runway that bisects the city, the cargo planes visible in the background, and Skyla's identity as a working pilot rather than simply a trainer who happens to specialize in flying types all contribute to a sense of a city that is connected to somewhere else, that exists as a point of transit rather than a destination in itself. That quality of being in between, of being a place that connects rather than contains, fits the flying type's natural associations with movement and height. Iciris City exists at the edge of the Ixaris marshland, a location that is literally inaccessible in certain seasons. The city's isolation varies with the time of year, and that variability gives it a quality that no other city in Unova shares. It is a place that retreats into itself during certain periods and becomes more reachable during others. The Ice-type gym within it, led by Bryson, fits this seasonal rhythm. Ice is a type associated with extremes, with barriers and preservation, and the temporary states that winter creates. A city that can be more or less cut off from the rest of the region, depending on the weather, understands its type specialist better than most gym cities do. Opelucid City exists in two versions across the two games, which is one of the more deliberately symbolic design choices in the pair. In Pokémon Black, Opelucid City appears modernized and technological, with sleek architecture and a forward-looking aesthetic. In Pokémon White, it appears traditional and antiquated, with older buildings and a visual character that references the past rather than the future. Both versions are home to the same dragon-type gym, led by the same gym leader in a different visual context. The city is asking a question about whether holding on to the past and reaching toward the future are opposed or whether they are simply different expressions of the same impulse. Undella Town, found in the far east of Unova along a stretch of beach, functions as the region's vacation destination. It is smaller than most cities and defined by summer atmosphere, by the sensation of somewhere that exists primarily to be enjoyed rather than passed through. Cynthia, the champion of the Sinnoh region, maintains a villa there. Her presence connects Unova to the world beyond its own borders in a way that feels lived in rather than mechanical. She did not come to Undella for a plot reason. She came because it is beautiful and she likes it there. The village of Lacunosa carries a darkness that the game deposits gradually rather than announcing. Its wall, its curfew, its folklore about the creature from the chasm, and its residents who follow rules they no longer fully understand, all accumulate into a portrait of a community shaped by fear that has been so thoroughly normalized it no longer identifies itself as fear. People follow the rules because the rules are the rules. The original urgency has been forgotten, but the behavior it produced has remained. That dynamic of a fear so old it has become custom is something the game trusts its players to recognize without labeling it. As we settle a little more deeply into the architecture of Unova, the game's approach to the Pokémon League itself reveals a structural decision that was made with the region's themes in mind. The Pokémon League in Unova requires the player to obtain all 8 badges and then travel to a specific location on the eastern edge of the region. The journey there is not simply a route, but a gauntlet of trainers and challenges that escalates consistently, preparing the player for the Elite Four in a way that feels organic rather than artificial. The Victory Road in Unova was designed to be genuinely difficult, to require a fully developed team rather than simply a team that had been assembled for the sake of having 6 Pokémon. The Elite Four of Pokémon Black and White were designed as 4 distinct personalities rather than 4 escalating difficulty tiers. Chantal, who specializes in ghost types, is a writer who uses the macabre and the unusual as creative material. Marshall, who uses fighting types, is a physical practitioner whose mentor was Alder himself. Grimsley, already discussed in terms of his gambling aesthetic, rounds out the group with a dark type specialty that suggests moral ambiguity. Caitlin, the psychic type specialist, appears in an unusual position for a Pokémon game. She had appeared in a previous generation's Battle Frontier, where she was described as a young trainer whose psychic powers would become dangerous if she lost her temper. By the time of Black and White, she has become an Elite Four member, implying that she has developed the control that her earlier appearance suggested she was still working toward. Caitlin's presence in both the previous generation's content and the Unova Elite Four is one of the more carefully constructed continuities in the franchise. Her arc from volatile young prodigy to composed Elite Four member is never described directly in the games. It is simply implied by her two appearances and the time that separates them. Players who had encountered her before would recognize what her new position represented. Players who hadn't would simply meet a poised, elegant trainer. The character works on both levels simultaneously. The Unova Elite Four's chambers were each designed to reflect the type specialty of the trainer within. Chantal's room contains bookshelves and candles, creating a library that feels slightly haunted. Marshall's space is open and architecturally severe, a training hall stripped of ornamentation. Grimsley's chamber has the visual language of a card den, with patterns and colors that reference gambling aesthetics. Caitlin's room is almost entirely white, a calm and clinical space that reflects the precision she now applies to her psychic power. The consistency between trainer personality and physical space was unusual for the series, and gave each Elite Four member a quality of genuine habitation rather than simply occupation. The 4 spiral staircases that lead to each chamber, as noted earlier, spiral a different number of times, depending on the gender of the trainer waiting at the top. That detail becomes more interesting when one considers it alongside the broader attention to symmetry and asymmetry that runs through the game's design. The game is built on pairs, on opposites, on things that mirror each other imperfectly. 2 staircases in 1 staircase is itself a pair where the numbers do not match, a small asymmetry embedded in the architecture of the most prestigious location in the region. Champion Alder's chamber, beyond the Elite Four, was designed to feel earned in a way that previous champion rooms had not always managed. Reaching Alder required passing through all 4 Elite Four members, but it also required understanding something about the game's story that purely mechanical progress could not provide. Alder is not simply the strongest trainer. He is a person who has questioned whether strength has meaning and has not yet arrived at a satisfying answer. Battling him feels like a conversation between 2 positions rather than simply a test of power, which is appropriate for the end of a game built around exactly that kind of conversation. As we drift a little further into how Unova shaped its secondary characters, the companions and rivals who accompany the player's journey deserve attention as a connected group rather than as individual figures. Bianca's development across the story of Pokémon Black and White is gentle in a way that the game's more dramatic story beats sometimes obscure. She begins as a trainer whose father does not want her to travel, whose confidence in her own abilities is limited, and whose cheerfulness can read as a defense against acknowledging the gap between what she hopes for herself and what she can actually achieve. Her journey is not a triumphant arc. It is a quieter one. She does not become the strongest trainer. She becomes a person who has honestly assessed herself and found that path valuable, even though it leads somewhere other than the top. By the time of Pokémon Black 2 and White 2, Bianca has become Professor Juniper's assistant, a person who has channeled her interest in Pokemon into a form of engagement that suits what she discovered about herself during her journey. The shift from aspiring Pokemon champion to Pokemon researcher is not presented as a defeat. It is presented as the right outcome for the right person. That kind of developmental honesty about what people become, rather than what they set out to become, is rare in stories aimed at a younger audience. Sharon's arc moves in the opposite direction in terms of what he discovers about the thing he has been pursuing. He begins as a trainer who is entirely focused on becoming strong, who defines his own worth through his ability to defeat opponents. The game systematically challenges that definition without dismissing it. Being strong is not presented as a foolish ambition. The question the game raises through Sharon is whether strength pursued without understanding why strength matters is enough. By the end, Sharon has won battles, but has not found the satisfaction he expected from winning them. His role in the sequel, having become a gym leader who now teaches young trainers, shows a person who found a different relationship with strength. He still values it. He still pursues it. But he now pursues it within a framework of mentorship and education rather than simple domination. The change in his context changes what his strength means, which is the answer the original game was quietly building toward without stating it directly. The relationship between Bianca and Sharon as a complementary pair reinforces the game's interest in how two people can begin from similar circumstances and end up shaped by very different lessons. They are childhood friends of the player character who set out at the same time and arrive in different places. Neither outcome is presented as superior to the other. Both are presented as honest. That even-handedness in treating multiple paths as valid without implying that one is the right answer and the others are consolation prizes is part of what gives the Unova games their emotional texture. Professor Juniper, who serves as the player's guide at the beginning of the game, was notable for being the first female professor in the main series to hold that role. She is energetic and informal compared to most Pokemon professors, with a personality that feels more like a graduate student who loves her work than an authority figure who dispenses wisdom from a position of settled knowledge. Her enthusiasm is genuine rather than performed, which gives the early hours of the game a lightness that the story's heavier themes later work against productively. Her father, Cedric Juniper, appears during the game to provide additional support and information, creating one of the few parent-child relationships in the franchise where both figures are present and functional. The Juniper family dynamic, such as it is given how little screen time it occupies, implies a world where the work of Pokemon research is something that runs in families and connects generations without being presented as burdensome inheritance. Team Plasma as a collective requires closer examination than most villain organizations in the franchise received at the time. Previous teams had been organized around clear motives, greed, power, environmental radicalism, and cosmic manipulation. But Team Plasma's central argument was philosophically legitimate in a way that those others were not. The claim that capturing and keeping Pokemon in small containers, forcing them to battle, and defining their entire existence by their relationship to a human trainer was cruel was not obviously wrong. The game did not dismiss it. The game allowed it to be stated clearly and with feeling, and then showed the gap between the genuine version of that argument, represented by N, and the manipulated version of it, represented by Ghetsis' intentions. That gap between authentic concern and exploited concern is one of the more adult observations the franchise had embedded in a main series game. Team Plasma's grunts were mostly sincere. They believed what they were told because what they were told was not entirely false. The falsehood was in the motivation behind that argument, rather than in the argument itself, and distinguishing between the two required the kind of thinking the game was actively encouraging the player to do throughout. The Plasma Sages, who appear as mid-level figures within Team Plasma, represented a group of people who constructed an ideology with genuine philosophical investment and then allowed that ideology to be used as a vehicle for someone else's power. Their conversations after their defeat in the postgame carry a quality of genuine reckoning, of people confronting what their intellectual work was used for. These conversations are brief and mostly optional, but they add a layer to Team Plasma that most optional post-story content does not attempt. As we drift into considering the ecological design of Unova's Pokémon more closely, patterns begin to emerge that reveal how deliberately the regional dex was constructed. The early roots of Unova feature Pokémon that feel integrated into their environments in ways that go beyond simple type matching. Patrat and Lillipup, the first wild Pokémon most players encounter, are a surveillance-oriented rodent and a small dog, both creatures associated with loyalty and observation. Their Pokédex entries describe behaviors connected to watching and guarding, to the small-scale alertness that characterizes creatures living at the edge of human settlement. They are not merely placeholder Pokémon for early roots. They are creatures designed to feel ecologically appropriate to the kinds of spaces where humans and Pokémon first come into contact. The Pidove line, which evolves into Tranquil and then Unfezant, follows the classic early root bird formula, but does so with a design philosophy that acknowledges the urban nature of much of Unova's terrain. Pidove specifically is described as a city bird, the kind that gathers in public squares and adapts easily to human infrastructure. Its Pokédex entries mention that it is so accustomed to human presence that it no longer responds to most human behaviors with alarm. That quality of urban habituation, of a wild creature that has learned to coexist with human density, fits Unova's landscape in a way that the generic early root bird of previous generations did not always achieve. The Audino, found throughout the Unova roots, was designed with a specific mechanical purpose in addition to its ecological role. It appears with unusual frequency in rustling grass and provides a large amount of experience points when defeated. This made Audino a valuable training resource for players trying to raise their teams. The design choice to embed that mechanical function in a creature whose Pokédex entries describe it as gentle and healing-oriented, a creature that listens to the health of others, is a quiet irony. The most commonly fought Pokémon in Unova is designed as a caregiver. The Sewaddle and Swadloon and Leavanny line moves through the metaphor of protective wrapping in a way that gives its three stages a conceptual continuity. Sewaddle wears a leaf hood. Swadloon wraps itself entirely in leaves for warmth and camouflage. Leavanny uses its sewing ability to make leaf coverings for smaller Pokémon, extending the protective impulse outward from itself toward others. The evolution from receiving protection to providing it is a small developmental arc embedded in the design of a simple bug and grass type family. Venipede and its evolutions, culminating in Scolipede, represent the more aggressive end of Unova's bug-type offerings. Scolipede is large and fast, and designed to feel genuinely dangerous, which is unusual for a Pokémon whose pre-evolutions are relatively modest in scale. The shift from small to imposing across the evolutionary line communicates something about how certain creatures grow into their full potential only at the end of a process that does not immediately reveal where it is going. The Sandile line, leading to Crocodile, is built around the metaphor of a creature that buries itself in sand and attacks from below, using the environment as camouflage and weapon simultaneously. Crocodile's design is notably stylized, with sunglasses like eye markings that give it a quality of knowing menace. The creature looks like it has seen things and decided that most of them were worth taking advantage of. That quality of world-weary opportunism, embedded in the design of a crocodile Pokémon, fits Unova's more morally complex atmosphere. Darumaka and Darmanitan were designed around the Daruma doll, a traditional Japanese toy similar to the Okiagari Koboshi, but associated specifically with Bodhidharma, the monk credited with bringing Zen Buddhism to China. The Daruma doll's eyes are left blank until a wish or goal is set, at which point one eye is filled in and the other is filled in only when the goal is achieved. Darmanitan's design incorporates the doll's rounded form and red coloring, and its Zen mode, which activates when its health drops below half, transforms it into a serene, meditating form that is physically weaker but radiates calm. The mechanical transformation mirrors the spiritual tradition behind the design more closely than most ability-based form changes manage. Minccino and Cinccino are creatures defined by their obsession with cleanliness. The Pokédex describes Minccino as unable to tolerate dirty environments, constantly cleaning objects and locations with its tail. Cinccino's fur is described as coated in a natural oil that repels dust and water, making the creature itself an expression of the thing it values most. The design of a creature whose essential quality is reflected in its physical makeup, where the character trait and the biological fact are the same thing, is a small but satisfying piece of design economy. Gothita's line has been mentioned earlier, but the Solosis line, its counterpart version exclusive family, represents a different kind of psychological interiority. Reuniclus, the final form of the Solosis line, is described as having such a powerful brain that it can use psychic power simply by thinking, and that when two Reuniclus shake hands, they merge their brains and become even more intelligent. That image of intelligence enhanced by connection, of two minds joining rather than competing, stands in quiet contrast to the game's many references to conflict and opposition. The Ducklet and Swanna line exists within the broader waterfowl tradition of Pokémon design, but achieves something specific through Swanna's association with classical dance. The Pokédex entry for Swanna describes it performing an elegantly choreographed dance as the sun sets before it sleeps. A Pokémon that marks the end of each day with an act of beauty that finds a ritual in the transition from light to dark carries a quality of quiet ceremony that most water-type Pokémon do not attempt. Vanillite's line, already discussed briefly, warrants a slightly longer examination in the context of how Unova's Pokémon relate to human food culture. The Unova region, based on New York and the northeastern United States, is a region where food culture has enormous significance. Ice cream is specifically a food associated with summer celebration, with leisure and indulgence, and Vanillux's final form with its two heads and elaborate appearance captures something of the theatrical quality that elaborate ice cream creations can have. Whether or not the design works as a Pokémon is a matter of taste, but the cultural context it was drawn from is coherent. As we drift a little deeper through the regional decks of Unova, the creatures that inhabit its water roots carry their own quiet stories. Timpole, Palpitoad, and Seismitoad form a line built around the resonance of sound in water, around the way vibration moves through liquid. Palpitoad's Pokédex entries describe it using the vibrations of its bumps to intimidate opponents and communicate with others of its kind across long distances. Seismitoad's entries note that it can send seismic waves through the ground by stomping, affecting everything in its territory simultaneously. The family is connected by the concept of force, transmitted through medium rather than delivered directly, which gives it a thematic unity that goes beyond simple type matching. Alamamola's design has a quality of pure compassion that is unusual for a creature with no evolutionary connection to Luvdisk, the heart-shaped water Pokémon of an earlier generation, despite the visual similarities between them. Alomomola exists without evolving, in its final form from the beginning, surrounded by a pink healing membrane that the Pokédex describes as being used to wrap injured Pokémon and carry them to shore. The creature is entirely defined by its willingness to care for others without expectation of anything in return. That quality of uncomplicated giving is something the game places in an ocean route Pokémon rather than a legendary or a story-important figure, which is a quiet kind of emphasis. Frillish and Jellicent were designed to feel like they belong to a different era of the ocean, like creatures from a time when the sea was imagined as a place of formal ceremony rather than simply a body of water. The Victorian formal dress applied to jellyfish creates a creature that feels out of time in an interesting way. The Pokédex account of Jellicent creating a palace from the ships it has sunk gives it a kind of underwater sovereignty, a creature that has staked a territorial claim on the seabed using the evidence of its own predation. The macabre domesticity of that image, a palace built from ships and bones, is typically Pokémon in its willingness to be quietly dark. The Remoraid and Octillery line, familiar from earlier generations, appears in Unova as an established species rather than a new introduction. Finding Pokémon from previous generations in Unova routes was a design decision that reinforced the sense that Unova was a real place with an established natural history rather than a contained environment where only new species existed. The presence of familiar Pokémon in Unova's water, Basculin alongside Goldeen, Frillish alongside Alomomola, created an ecology that felt layered with time rather than freshly constructed. The underwater caves of Route 6 and the surrounding water routes carry Pokémon that the overland routes do not, creatures that require surf or dive to encounter, and that therefore occupy a stratum of Unova invisible to players who do not look for it. This hidden layer of the ecology was a feature of previous games as well, but Unova's water routes were particularly rich with it, containing Pokémon whose Pokédex entries described deep water behaviors and adaptations to pressure and darkness. The world below the surface of Unova's ocean was designed to feel genuine rather than merely mechanical. As we drift into consideration of how Unova's post-game content extended the world beyond the main story's ending, the design philosophy behind those additions becomes clear. The post-game areas of Pokémon Black and White were designed to ask questions that the main story had not fully resolved. The Abyssal Ruins, accessible via dive in the far eastern waters of Unova, contained ancient inscriptions that referenced a king who ruled over Unova in a distant past. The inscriptions, which could be translated using an in-game item, described a figure who sought to use legendary Pokémon to control the world, a narrative that rhymed with the game's main story without being identical to it. The ruins implied that what the player had just experienced was not unique in the history of Unova, that the tension between those who seek to use legendary power and those who oppose them had played out before and would play out again. The Black City and White Forest, the version-exclusive late-game areas, expanded in response to the player's wireless interactions with other players. Black City grew larger and more populated the more people the player met through wireless connection. White Forest became richer with Pokémon and trainers the more wireless interactions occurred. Both areas were designed to feel like they existed in a state of potential that could be realized or neglected depending on how the player engaged with the game's social dimensions. The National Pokédex, obtainable after completing the main story, opened the Unova routes to Pokémon from all previous generations. This post-story expansion of the available ecology was presented as the natural consequence of the world changing in the aftermath of the main story's events. The lifting of restrictions that had kept Unova's ecology contained to regional species was framed not as a mechanical reward, but as a natural opening of borders that the story's resolution had made possible. The world becoming more varied was presented as a consequence of peace, rather than a feature unlocked by achievement. The PokeStar Studios, introduced in the sequel games, created a space for storytelling within the game's world that was self-consciously fictional. Players participated in scripts, following scenarios that were explicitly framed as films being made, with audiences reacting to the results and the films being added to a library that grew with each production. The meta-quality of making a film within a game, of constructing a fictional narrative inside a fictional world, was handled with a lightness that kept it from becoming too conceptually heavy. The films were simply fun, small stories with their own internal logic, and their presence in Unova's world suggested a culture that had developed artistic forms beyond the trainer journey. The Pokémon World Tournament, the major post-story facility of the sequel games, had a depth of content that rewarded extended play far beyond what the main story required. Trainers from across all previous Pokémon generations could be challenged in various tournament formats, with dialogue that reflected each trainer's character and acknowledged the time that had passed since their original appearances. The veteran trainers of previous games spoke like people who had continued their work in the years since their original stories. Red, the silent protagonist of the original games, appeared in the tournament without saying a word, which is entirely consistent with how he was presented in Generation 2 when he could be found atop Mount Silver, having apparently been training there alone for years. The tournaments within the Pokémon World Tournament were structured at different difficulty levels, with entry requirements that pushed players to maintain multiple specialized teams. The championship format required defeating several trainers in sequence without healing between battles, which demanded a depth of team preparation that casual play had not been required to develop. The facility was designed for players who had moved beyond the main story and wanted a challenge that would test everything they had learned about the game's mechanics. As we settle into the final perspective of this long and gentle drift through Unova, the things the region says about endings and beginnings deserve their own quiet space. Pokémon Black and White 2 are sequels in a form the series had never attempted before. They are not remakes. They are not direct continuations that follow the same protagonist. They are stories set in the same region 2 years after the events of the original games, following new protagonists whose paths cross with the survivors of the previous story. The structural decision to return to Unova with new eyes after a gap of 2 years was one of the series' more ambitious creative choices, and it paid off in ways that are easiest to see in retrospect. The changed Unova of the sequels has been marked by what happened in the original games. Certain locations have been transformed. Some routes carry evidence of Team Plasma's former activities. The climate around the giant chasm has been affected by the events involving Kyurem and the DNA splicers. The world shows the passage of time in its geography rather than simply in its characters, which is a quality that most Pokémon games do not attempt. The new protagonist of the sequels begins their journey in Aspertia City, a location that did not appear in the original games and that is positioned at the edge of Unova rather than its center. Starting from a new location in a familiar region created an experience of approaching Unova from an unexpected angle, of seeing things that had been in the background of the original games move to the foreground. Routes and cities that had been brief stops in the first games became important locations in the second, and the familiarity of the region was used productively rather than simply relied upon. The rival of the sequel games, named Hugh by default, carries a personal motivation that is different from the rivals of the original games. His sister had a Pokémon stolen from her by Team Plasma years earlier, and he is looking for it throughout the story. His anger is directed at a specific wrong, rather than at a diffuse ambition to be the best. The emotional directness of his motivation, the simple fact of wanting to recover something taken from someone he loves, gives him a different quality from Charon and Bianca, and that difference works productively within the sequel's more emotionally direct tone. The remnant of Team Plasma in the sequel games is divided between those who accepted N's departure and the original mission's end, and those who continued under Ghetsis' leadership with a new and more explicitly violent agenda. The fracturing of Team Plasma into competing factions, with the original members having genuinely converted to a more benign position, and the Ghetsis loyalists having shed even the philosophical justification for their actions, creates a villain group whose internal complexity mirrors the moral thinking the original games encouraged. Not all of Team Plasma was the same. The sequel demonstrates the difference between what different members became after the ideology that had united them was exposed as compromised. Ghetsis in the sequel has moved beyond manipulation and arrived at something more nakedly destructive. His plan in the second games involves using QREM to freeze Unova, a scheme with no philosophical justification and no pretense of concern for Pokémon. He has discarded the instrument of N because N no longer serves his purposes. The version of Ghetsis in the sequel is the same person who was always there beneath the ideology, stripped of the cover that made him presentable. The sequel is asking what a person becomes when they have nothing left to hide behind. The final confrontation of the sequel games carries a different emotional register from the original. Where the first game's ending asked players to consider what they believed and why, the second game's ending asks players to reckon with consequence, with the results of choices made years earlier and the people those choices shaped or damaged. The Resolutions is more explicitly final than the original's open ending, but it does not quite close every door. Ghetsis is defeated. The world continues. Some things have been repaired, and some cannot be. N's brief reappearance in the sequel, arriving on Reshiram or Zekrom to assist against Kyurem, is designed as a moment of quiet closure without being a restoration of what was. He has been traveling and thinking. He has arrived at something he did not have before, which the game implies without stating clearly. He does not reclaim his role as the previous game's central character. He simply helps and then continues on his way, which is the right thing for him to do at that point in his story. The ending of Pokémon Black 2 and White 2 is quieter than the ending of the originals in some ways and louder in others. The threat has been more concretely resolved, the damage has been more specifically named, but the world that remains at the end of the second pair of games is a world that has been genuinely changed by two separate stories, that carries the marks of two different sets of events, and that looks forward without pretending that what happened did not happen. That quality of a world that acknowledges its own history while continuing to exist is perhaps the most mature thing the Unova games ever managed, and they managed it twice in two different games that together form one of the more carefully constructed narrative arcs the franchise has produced. These are the deeper mysteries of Unova, the ones that require sitting with the games rather than simply completing them, the ones that open up on the second look and the third and the one you take years later when the memory of the first is settled enough to compare against. Every Pokémon game is built around the journey. The player begins in a small town, moves outward into a larger world, and arrives eventually at something that feels like a destination. But Unova complicates that structure in a way that is easy to feel and difficult to articulate. The journey through Unova is not simply a geographic progression. It is a moral one in which the player is asked to think about what they are doing while they do it, to carry questions about the ethics of their own activity, even as they continue performing that activity. That is an unusual thing for a game to ask of its player, and Unova asks it without apology. The Celestial Tower, which sits in the middle of the region rather than at its edges, places grief at the geographic center of the journey. Players who climb it do so surrounded by trainers who have come to mourn. The bell at the top can be rung by the player, and the sound it produces carries across the immediate area. There is no mechanical reward for ringing the bell. The only consequence is the sound and whatever the player brings to the act of making it. That moment of ringing a bell for Pokémon who have died in a tower built specifically for that purpose, in the middle of a game about capturing and training Pokémon, is as honest as the franchise has ever been about the weight of what it asks players to do. The routes between cities in Unova are designed to feel like journeys in themselves, rather than simply transit between destinations. Route 10, the final route before the Pokémon League in the original games, is a long mountain path that narrows and steepens as it approaches Victory Road. The escalating difficulty of the wild Pokémon encountered there, the increasingly powerful trainers positioned along the way, and the visual shift from open terrain to enclosed stone passages all work together to communicate that the player is approaching something that requires everything that came before. The route is not just a road, it is a preparation. The bridges of Unova, which have been referenced throughout this journey, deserve one final consideration as a collective rather than individually. Unova has more bridges than any other Pokémon region, and each one crosses a specific kind of space. Some cross water, some cross chasms, some connect neighborhoods within the same city. The Driftvale Drawbridge is the only one that can be raised and lowered, that can be closed to transit, that can make a crossing impossible until the right conditions are met. The others are always open, always passable, always offering the connection they were built to provide. That distinction between the bridge that can close and the bridges that remain open is a quiet image of the difference between conditional and unconditional connection, between the kind of harmony that requires specific circumstances and the kind that persists regardless. The Unova region, which was built on the question of whether truth and ideals could be bridged, chose to represent its central metaphor in the architecture of its landscape, rather than only in the dialogue of its characters. The bridges are everywhere. Most of them are always open. There is one detail about Unova that belongs at the very end of everything else, because it is the kind of detail that works best when everything else has already settled. The name of the antagonist organization, Team Plasma, is a reference to the fourth state of matter: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. Plasma is the state that most people on Earth never directly encounter, the state of superheated ionized matter found in stars and lightning and the flames of certain kinds of fire. It is the most common state of matter in the observable universe, and the least familiar to ordinary experience. It is everywhere and largely invisible to the people who live among its products. An organization that named itself after the most pervasive and least understood form of matter, whose stated purpose was to free Pokémon from the humans who possess them without fully understanding them, whose leader was a person shaped by forces he could not see clearly, operating in a world whose full complexity was hidden from him, is an organization whose name was chosen with more intention than it first appears to carry. Plasma is what you get when you apply enough energy to a gas to strip away the electrons from the atoms. The familiar structure comes apart, and something else takes its place. The Team Plasma that gets us built was a structure designed to come apart at the right moment, to apply pressure to something until it separated into something he could use. That the franchise encoded that dynamic in the name of the organization, quietly and without announcement, is the kind of thing Unova does that rewards the patient and the attentive. The region was always asking you to look closer, and there was always something there when you did. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there is another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you.